Hello, my name is Steve Kaufman. I've written a book titled The Nature of Reality, What We Really Are and the Amazing Story of How We Got Here. And this is the fourth video in a series of videos I'm making that tells the same story I already told in the book. And the purpose of both the book and this series of videos is to provide you with the opportunity to become aware of the nature of reality, so you can understand the extremely bizarre situation that the reality that you really are has placed itself in as a result of flowing through and animating what appears to be a time-bound and very finite physical body, but is actually beyond that physical surface appearance, a relationally structured form of the timeless, deathless, formless, and infinite reality that you really are. Now, in the last two videos, I explained in detail how the timeless, deathless, and formless awareness that is actually there, where both your physical body and the rest of the physical universe only appear to be, structurally evolves into the three progressive levels of relational awareness structure that are actually there, where we perceive and conceive the physical realities of space, light, and matter to be. And in this video, I'm going to explain how that same formless reality, once it is functioning as a third level of relational structure, is able to form a new and unique relation with itself that involves it flowing through and animating certain third level relational structures, thereby causing those third level structures to then function as the fourth level relational awareness structures that are actually there where we perceive and conceive any bit of living or animated matter to be. Because, as I have tried to make clear in all three videos and will continue to try to make clear in every video, even though the universe in which we find ourselves appears to consist of empty physical space that contains various forms of physical energy, those physical appearances are just that, which is to say they are all just appearances or apparent realities that are being superimposed by our minds upon the relationally and progressively structured awareness that is actually there, where all those mind-generated physical appearances only appear to be. Because ultimately, those mind-generated physical appearances, as created appearances, are no more real than reflections, projections, or rainbows. And as hard as it may be to comprehend at this point, it is the formless awareness that is aware or conscious of all the created physical appearances that is the uncreated, timeless, deathless, and infinite reality that is both actually there and what you really are. As I've said before, name one reality of which you are not aware. And let me save you some time, because it can't be done, because there is no such reality. And while that simple and undeniable fact should have clued us into the fundamental nature of the reality that we refer to as awareness, it didn't, and still for the most part hasn't. And that's because the formless awareness that you really are, as it flows through and animates the relationally structured forms of itself that we perceive and conceive as our physical bodies, has made the unavoidable mistake of mistaking what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances for being realities that are actually there, thereby causing your awareness to inadvertently obscure its own reality from itself, leaving you, as that awareness, completely unaware of the timeless and deathless reality that you really are, and aware of yourself instead as being what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances that, as I've already noted, are no more real than reflections, projections, and rainbows. And I'm repeating myself in this video format, both as a way of promoting the book and also as a way of providing human beings with the information contained in the book, because my main purpose in all of this is not to sell books, although that would be nice. Instead, my main purpose is to provide human beings with information they can use to free themselves from the mind-generated experiential cages in which they do not even know they are trapped, because, whether you know it or not, the effective entrapment of your awareness in a mind-generated experiential cage is the source of pretty much everything that you experience and become aware of as psychological suffering, and is also the source of the suffering that human beings inflict upon each other as they grapple with and try to escape or do away with that psychological suffering. And human beings, by and large, do not realize they are trapped in mind-generated experiential cages because, while trapped in those cages, the walls of the cage, which consist of what we are aware of as physical and mental reality, are mistakenly believed to be what is real and all that is real, and also what we really are. And people tend to spend their lives with their awarenesses effectively trapped in mind-generated experiential cages because they don't try to escape a cage that they don't recognize as a cage, because they instead mistakenly believe that cage to be what is real and all is real, and also what they really are. And so they tend to just stay put. But that's not to say that people don't make great efforts to escape the suffering that being trapped in such a cage produces. It's just that their efforts to escape that suffering never really puts an end to that suffering, because those efforts are almost never directed at escaping the experiential cage, but are instead directed at just rearranging the elements of that cage in some way so that it is, for some brief period of time, somewhat less unpleasant to occupy. It's a perfect trap, because once an individual awareness enters into a mind-generated experiential environment and then closes the door behind it by mistakenly believing in what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances as being realities that are actually there, where they do, without question, appear to be, no matter how horrible and painful life in that experiential environment turned experiential cage becomes, that awareness almost never does the one thing that it needs to do to put a true end to its suffering, which is to simply step out of that experiential cage by projecting itself beyond the experiential environment that its mind is creating, which it can do at any time because they're just appearances and the door is never locked. And the door is never locked because such an awareness is always free to change what it mistakenly believes regarding the nature of the mind-generated experiential realities, except it almost never does because, for reasons I will get into shortly, once the door has been closed, it no longer appears as a door, but instead appears as a wall, meaning the mistaken belief regarding the nature of the mind-generated experiential realities no longer appears as just a belief, but instead appears as the way things actually are, and so no longer appears as something over which one's awareness has any control. And people don't even try to project their awareness beyond their mind-generated experiential environments, because once an experiential environment has been converted into an experiential cage by mistakenly believing that what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances are realities that are actually there, there no longer appears to be any reality beyond that experiential environment they can direct their awareness toward or into. And that's because when an individual awareness mistakenly believes in what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances as being realities that are actually there, that mistaken belief converts those experiential appearances into reality-obscuring delusions, in the same way that mistakenly believing what is only a reflection to be the reality that's actually there converts that created appearance into a delusion that obscures from one's awareness the mirror that's actually there, and which mirror one has to be looking right at, else one would not be aware of the reflection. And the reality that's being obscured by the physical and mental appearances turned illusions is the reality that is actually there, where those mind-generated experiential appearances, as created appearances, only appear to be. And because the reality that is actually there, where physical and mental reality only appear to be, is the reality that you really are, the obscuring of the reality that is actually there from your awareness is the obscuring of your own reality from yourself. And once your awareness has inadvertently and unknowingly obscured its own reality from itself, it is left with nothing to know as either real or as itself, other than the mind-generated physical and mental experiential appearances, and also emotional reality, which is also a created appearance. And in that way, mind-generated experiential appearances that are no more real than reflections, projections, and rainbows are converted into the walls of a cage in which your individual awareness inadvertently and unknowingly traps itself, as a function of doing nothing more than continuing to believe that what are only created appearances are realities that are actually there. And what then ensues is the shit show that we refer to as human existence, as individual human awarenesses scramble about in a mostly futile effort to rid themselves of the psychological suffering that being trapped in such an experiential cage inevitably produces, doing everything they can think of to rid themselves of that suffering or just lessen it for a bit, while almost never doing the one very simple thing that could truly rid them of that suffering, which is to just stop converting the experiential appearances into an experiential cage by ceasing to continuously convert the mind-generated physical and mental appearances into reality-obscuring delusions, by ceasing to mistakenly believe in those created experiential appearances in a way that converts them into self-obscuring delusions, and so converts them into the walls of a cage in which one's awareness becomes effectively trapped. And as already mentioned, the mind-generated physical and mental appearances function as reality-obscuring and so self-obscuring delusions, not because they have the ability to block our awarenesses from getting past them and into the reality that's actually there, which also happens to be the reality that we really are, but only because, as delusions, they present us with the appearance that there is no reality beyond them to direct our awareness toward, and so we just don't and almost never do, which then leaves our awarenesses effectively trapped in experiential appearances that are now functioning as experiential cages, where we then suffer. And because that is the situation that human beings, by and large, have been and continue to be caught up in, that is also, in all likelihood, the situation that you, as a human being, are also caught up in. And because that is the situation, it is simply the case that directing your awareness beyond the experiential appearances and becoming directly aware of the formless, non-physical, non-mental, non-apparent reality that is actually there is the only way to free your awareness from the mind-generated experiential cage in which you are, in all likelihood, presently trapped. And so is the only way to truly put an end to the suffering that you will inevitably become aware of and experience while trapped in that cage. Because if you spend your whole organic life aware of only the physical and mental appearances that your mind is creating, as well as emotional reality, which is also just a created appearance, believing them to be what is real and all that is real, then you will have spent your whole organic life in complete unawareness of what you really are and of what the universe really is as well. And I can tell you from personal experience that organic life is a much more pleasant experience and a much more enjoyable ride once you begin to utilize your innate ability to become directly aware of the formless, timeless, and deathless reality that is actually there where the physical universe only appears to be. But in order to begin to utilize that innate ability, you first need to become aware that there is a reality there beyond the mind-generated experiential appearances that you can project your awareness toward and into. And because that is the case, what I am doing is providing human beings with information that will make it possible for them to become aware of the situation they are in, so they can recognize and realize that there is a reality there beyond the experiential appearances that they can become aware of, should they choose to do so. And that reality is the reality that is both actually there and what they really are. To some degree, our situation is as if we had spent our whole lives watching a magic act, never knowing that it was all just a bunch of illusions designed to create the appearance that magic is actually being used and so actually exists. And in such a case, we would never even try to understand how the trick is done or how the illusion is being created, because why would we? Because we wouldn't believe it's a trick, because we wouldn't see the illusions as illusions. Instead, we would believe in the ultimate reality of the illusions, and so would naturally believe that magic is actually being used and so actually exists. And physical and mental reality are created appearances, and so are both a sort of illusion that our minds are able to produce. And those experiential appearances are designed to create the illusion that they are realities that are actually there. And that illusion serves a useful purpose because it provides our individual awarenesses with information that we need in order to guide the relationally structured forms of ourself that we are flowing through and animating through the relationally structured environment composed of ourself in which we must operate for as long as our individual awarenesses continue to flow through and animate the fourth level relational structures that are actually there where we perceive and conceive our physical bodies to be. But illusions do not have to function as reality-obscuring delusions. Instead, illusions only function as reality-obscuring delusions when we mistakenly believe what is only an illusion, and so is only an appearance, to be the reality that's actually there. Because once we do that, we stop trying to project our awareness beyond the illusion turned delusion, leaving us continuously unaware of the reality that is actually there, and continuously aware of the illusion turned delusion as being the reality that's actually there. And so belief is the key, because it is mistaken belief that turns what are only created appearances and illusions into reality obscuring delusions. And once a created appearance or illusion has been converted by mistaken belief in its nature into a reality obscuring delusion, a situation is established that makes it very difficult to stop believing in that appearance or illusion in that mistaken way. And that's because once an appearance has been converted into a reality obscuring delusion by mistaken belief, that mistaken belief then becomes inseparable from the delusion, and so no longer appears as just a belief, but instead appears as the way things actually are, for as long as the appearance turned delusion continues to appear as what is actually there. And the appearance turned delusion continues to appear as what is actually there for as long as one continues to apply the mistaken belief to it. And one continues to apply the mistaken belief to the appearance, because once the mistaken belief has been used to create the delusion, that belief then appears as the way things actually are, thereby creating an incredibly effective and vicious cycle that prevents an awareness from ever even questioning the mistaken belief that it is inadvertently and unknowingly using to convert some appearance into a reality obscuring delusion. And once that incredibly effective and vicious cycle has been put into motion by doing nothing more than applying a mistaken belief to some appearance, even when new appearances arise that should bring the mistaken belief into question, those new appearances are either completely ignored or, when they can't be completely ignored, are conceptually twisted in some way so they can then appear to align with the mistaken belief. Because again, the mistaken belief is no longer seen as just a belief, and so is no longer seen as something that one has the ability to change. And what that means is that the mistaken belief then becomes the conceptual reality to which all other appearances are made to conceptually conform, even when those appearances completely contradict that belief. And what that means is that rather than using what one experiences as reality to mold one's mental interpretations of reality, and so one's beliefs about reality, which is what should take place, one instead forces what one experiences as reality to be interpreted in a way that conforms with one's mistaken belief about reality. Because again, that mistaken belief is not seen as a belief, but is instead, as an inseparable part of the delusion it has been used to create, seen as the way things actually are. And that's because while operating from within a delusion, the mistaken belief that was used to convert the appearance into a delusion cannot be separated from the delusion. Because without it, there is no delusion. Because without it, there is only an appearance or illusion that can easily be known as an appearance or illusion, which is to say, as a created reality that's being superimposed upon whatever reality is actually there. But from within the delusion, the appearance the mistaken belief has been applied to and the mistaken belief itself, which is also just an appearance, both appear to exist in a way that is the complete opposite of the way they actually exist. Because from within the delusion, the created appearance appears as the reality that's actually there, and the mistaken belief, which again is also just a created appearance, and specifically is just a created conceptual appearance, appears as the way reality actually is. And so, once a mistaken belief has been used to convert an appearance into a delusion, that mistaken belief then appears to exist in such a way that it is never even allowed to be brought into question, because it no longer appears as something that can be brought to question, because it no longer appears as just a belief, but instead appears as the way reality actually is. And so it appears as a wall over which we have no control, instead of as the very closable and openable door that it actually is, and which door of belief we always have the ability to completely control, although we never exercise that ability while mistakenly seeing it as a wall, because why would we? And because the mistaken belief that is being used to convert what is only an appearance into a reality obscuring delusion can no longer be brought into question, the delusion itself cannot cease to be created, and so cannot cease to obscure from one's awareness the reality that is actually there, where the appearance turned delusion only appears to be. And so, once a mistaken belief has been used to convert an appearance into a delusion, a very effective and vicious cycle ensues that tends to keep one's awareness trapped in the delusional reality they have inadvertently and unknowingly created as a result of applying a mistaken belief to what is only an appearance. And specifically, by applying to what is only an appearance the mistaken belief that the appearance is the reality that's actually there. And that's why, once a created appearance or illusion has been converted by mistaken belief in its nature into a reality-obscuring delusion, a situation is established that makes it very difficult to stop believing in that appearance or illusion in a mistaken way. And that leaves one's awareness effectively trapped in that delusional reality, aware of only the now delusional appearance and completely unaware of the reality that is actually there, where the delusion, which is still just an appearance, only appears to be. And such a delusion-entrapped awareness almost never tries to leave the delusional reality, because from within the delusion there does not appear to be any place else to go. Instead, such a delusion-entrapped awareness tries to escape the suffering that being trapped in the delusion produces by trying to rearrange various elements of the delusion, and also by tunneling deeper into the delusion. And that incredibly effective and vicious cycle, wherein a mistaken belief converts an appearance into a delusion and simultaneously disguises itself and so hides itself within the delusion, is why human beings and so human awarenesses have remained effectively trapped in mind-generated experiential delusions for thousands of years, mistakenly believing those mind-generated physical and mental appearances to be realities that are both actually there and what they really are. Because from within the experiential delusion that mistaken belief is being used to create, that mistaken belief does not appear as just a belief, but instead appears as the way both reality and itself actually are. And so it is almost never brought into question. And that vicious cycle is also why increasing numbers of human beings or human awarenesses are tunneling ever deeper into increasingly delusional realities that bear increasingly less relation to any situation, circumstance, or reality that actually exists anywhere other than in their own minds, as they try to escape the suffering they must inevitably and unavoidably experience while effectively trapped in a delusional reality. Long story short, some human awarenesses try to escape the suffering that is being produced by their effective entrapment within an experiential delusion by tunneling deeper into that delusion, by producing a new delusion within that delusion, because at first it feels a little better within the new delusion until it doesn't, and then they tunnel deeper still by producing yet another delusion within the new delusion, and on it goes until you wind up with people who truly believe that there are people eating babies in the basement of a pizza parlor that doesn't even have a basement. It's many levels of crazy, because you don't just get there in one step. Instead, it's a gradual process that involves using a mistaken belief to convert an appearance into a delusion, after which it then becomes possible to use another mistaken belief to create another delusion within that prior delusion. And on it goes, leaving the awareness that has done so effectively trapped in a multi-layered and completely delusional reality that bears almost no relation to any situation, circumstance, or reality that actually exists anywhere other than in their own mind. And then such deeply trapped and deluded awarenesses actively seek out misinformation that confirms their delusional beliefs, because physical reality, which cannot tell a lie, comes to more and more exist in conflict with their delusional beliefs. And so they seek out misinformation that distorts physical reality and physical facts in such a way so that those now alternate facts, which is just an Orwellian term that means complete bullshit, then align with their delusional beliefs. And all of that tunneling into increasingly delusional realities is done as a means of attempting to escape the suffering that one must experience while one's awareness is effectively trapped in a delusional reality, completely unaware of the reality they really are. And the fundamental delusion upon which all other delusions rest is the experiential delusion. And just to be clear, the experiential delusion is the delusion that is created as a result of mistakenly believing that what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances are realities that are actually there. And at present, almost all human beings are caught up in that delusion, because almost all human beings continue to mistakenly believe that the mind-generated appearances that we refer to as physical and mental reality are realities that are actually there, because the mistaken belief that is produced in that delusion does not appear as a belief, but instead appears as an incontrovertible fact that cannot and should not be questioned. And in order to make the vicious cycle that is produced by the horribly effective synergy that exists between mistaken beliefs and the delusions they produce easier to understand, I am now going to present you with a very concrete and very real example of how the mechanism I just described operates to keep awarenesses unaware of the truth even when it is staring them right in the face, once those awarenesses have created and so entered into a delusional reality as a result of applying a false belief to some created appearance. Very close to 100 years ago, scientists discovered the phenomenon of wave-particle duality, and a badass science dude named Werner Heisenberg came up with something called the uncertainty principle. Oops, wrong Heisenberg. Here's the actual. And even though those discoveries should have at least brought into question what scientists continue to mistakenly assume is the objective nature of physical reality, which is just a formalization of the mistaken belief that physical reality is, in some way, shape, or form, the reality that's actually there, it didn't, because scientists simply would not, and for the most part still will not, allow that belief to be brought into question. And the reason they wouldn't, and mostly still won't, allow that mistaken belief to be brought into question is because from within the experiential delusion in which they and pretty much all of humanity were operating and continue to operate, that mistaken belief does not appear as a belief, but instead appears as the way reality actually is. Now, when pressed, scientists will admit that the objective interpretation of physical reality is just an unproven assumption, and so is just a belief. But the way they have treated that belief and assumption for the past 100 years demonstrates that at a deeper level, they do not see it as just a belief or as an assumption, but instead see it as the way reality actually is, and so as something that cannot and should not be questioned. And the evidence that they see their mistaken belief in physical objectivity as the way reality actually is, and so as something that cannot and should not be questioned, rather than as the unproven assumption or belief that it actually is, lies in the knots they have twisted themselves into over the past 100 years while trying to explain the overall appearance of physical reality, meaning how it appears at both the macroscopic and quantum levels in the context of the objective interpretation of physical reality. Physical reality at the macroscopic level appears determinate and so appears non-probabilistic or predictable. There is no denying that. On the other hand, physical reality at the quantum level appears indeterminate and unpredictable and so appears probabilistic. And there's also no denying that. And so beginning around 100 years ago, scientists were faced with two very conflicting and mutually exclusive realities, one of which was their belief that physical reality is an objective representation of reality, and so is in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there, and the other of which was the undeniable physical fact that the same exact physical reality could appear in two completely opposite and so mutually incompatible ways, i.e. as either a wave or as a particle, or as either predictable or probabilistic. And so scientists had two sets of opposite physical appearances and a belief regarding the nature of those physical appearances that seemed to be completely incompatible with those appearances. Because how could physical reality be an objective representation of reality if the same reality was able to appear in two completely opposite and so mutually exclusive ways, depending upon how it was looked at? You see, in general, saying that something is one thing implies that it is not the opposite thing. For example, if you say something is hot, then that is the same as saying it is not cold. Or if you say something is hard, that is the same as saying it is not soft. And in the same way, saying that something is a particle is the same as saying it is not a wave. And saying it is a wave is the same as saying it is not a particle. Likewise, saying that something is determinate and so predictable is the same as saying that it is not indeterminate and so is not unpredictable, while saying that something is indeterminate and unpredictable is the same as saying it is not determinate and so is not predictable. And yet, starting around 100 years ago, physical reality began presenting scientists with both of these sets of mutually incompatible appearances, as they developed the ability to probe into what became known as quantum level physical reality. And so, once wave particle duality and the probabilistic appearance of quantum level physical reality came along, scientists were faced with two mutually exclusive and so mutually incompatible versions of what they firmly believed and continue to believe is an objective physical reality, with one version being a particle-like, determinate, and so predictable physical reality, and the other version being a wave-like, indeterminate, and so unpredictable, and so probabilistic physical reality. And so at that point in history, scientists were faced with a choice with regard to how they would mentally interpret those completely incompatible and mutually exclusive physical appearances. And in general terms, the choice they had is as follows. One choice they could have made is they could have allowed those opposite physical appearances and the new way that physical reality appeared at the quantum level to change what they believed about the objective nature of physical reality, since there are things that we are all aware of that are able to behave exactly the same way that physical reality behaves in terms of presenting opposite appearances and also in terms of creating uncertainty, and those things are called reflections. That is, if you approach a mirror one way, you can be presented with one appearance, and if you approach that same mirror from a different or reflectively opposite direction, you can be presented with the opposite appearance. For example, if you placed a mirror on a beach near the water, you could stand in one spot and see water waves, and then stand in the reflectively opposite spot and instead see particulate sand. And that's because the appearance that you are presented with, and which appearance we refer to as a reflection, is not what's actually there, but is just an appearance that must be created as a function of a relation that you form with the mirror. And so the appearance that you create is not primarily a function of what's actually there as the mirror, and so it's not an objective representation of what's actually there. Instead, the appearance of reflection that is created is primarily a function of the reflection producing relation in which you become involved with the reality that is actually there. Inasmuch as one approach and so one relation can create one appearance, while a different or opposite approach and so different or opposite relation can create the opposite appearance. And if you do approach the mirror in one way and so create one appearance, it is simply not possible for you to simultaneously approach the same mirror in the opposite way in order to create the opposite appearance, because it is simply not possible to be simultaneously involved in a relation with something in what are mutually exclusive structural orientations, in the same way that you cannot possibly simultaneously stand on someone's left and right side, because those are mutually exclusive structural orientations, because being in one relation is the same as saying you are not in the opposite relation. And so, even though reflections, which are just a type of created appearance, exhibit both duality and uncertainty, and even though 100 years ago it was already known that the brain must be in some way responsible for creating what we are aware of as physical reality, that's not the path or approach that scientists chose in trying to mentally interpret the opposite appearances of the supposedly objective physical reality with which they had been presented. That is, scientists chose not to change their belief in the objective nature of physical reality to fit the new way that physical reality now appeared, which was in the form of opposite and so mutually exclusive physical appearances. Instead, the path and approach scientists chose was to stick with their belief in physical reality as being an objective representation of reality, and so the path they chose was to try to make the opposite and mutually exclusive physical appearances fit that belief. And trying to approach the problem of the opposite physical appearances in that way was not unreasonable. But what was unreasonable is that they did not even begin to consider the other choice, i.e., changing what they believe regarding the nature of physical reality. And what is and remains even more unreasonable is that even though 100 years have gone by with science still having arrived at no rational nor reasonable explanation for why physical reality appears and behaves as it does at the quantum level, scientists still refuse to even consider the other possibility. And if you don't believe me, then maybe you'll believe Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman, who said, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. Do not keep saying to yourself, if you can possibly avoid it, but how can it be like that? Because you will get down the drain into a blind alley from which nobody has yet escaped. Nobody knows how it can be like that." And that may have been true when he said it, but it is no longer true because I know exactly how it can be like that, and you can too, but only if you are willing to loosen your grip on your belief in physical reality as being an objective representation of reality, which means loosening your grip on your belief in physical reality as being in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there. Because as I've already demonstrated in the book and will demonstrate once again in video 6 by describing the simple structural mechanism by which all physical experiences and appearances of any sort are created, quantum physical reality is only a blind alley that has no reasonable, no rational explanation when you inadvertently blind yourself by refusing to even consider the possibility that physical reality, rather than being an objective representation of reality, is instead just a created appearance. And the vast majority of scientists still won't even consider the non-objective possibility because they don't see their belief in the objective nature of physical reality as a belief, but instead see it as the way reality actually is, and so as something that cannot and should not be questioned. And they see their mistaken belief in the objective nature of physical reality in that mistaken way because they are human beings, and human beings, with relatively few exceptions, are caught up in the experiential delusion. And from within that delusion, that mistaken belief does not appear as a belief, but instead appears as the way reality actually is, because that's the belief that's being used to create the experiential delusion. And so that's the belief that's hidden itself within that delusion by taking on the appearance of being the way reality actually is. And so, rather than using the new way physical reality appeared at the quantum level to change their belief about the nature of physical reality and thereby escape the experiential delusion, what scientists did instead, in order to quell the cognitive dissonance the opposite physical appearances created, is stick with their mistaken belief regarding the objective nature of physical reality and tunnel deeper into the experiential delusion by inventing a new mistaken belief that made it possible for them to create a new delusion within the primary delusion, and which new and deeper delusion is the probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality, which in essence is the idea that physical reality at its most fundamental level somehow exists in a probabilistic state, which is to say, in a state of maybe this or perhaps that. And the new mistaken belief they came up with that made it possible for them to create the new probabilistic delusion is the belief that the act of observation in some completely unknown and inexplicable way somehow magically and mysteriously transmogrifies and transmutes a fundamentally probabilistic physical reality into a determinate physical reality. And so in essence, what scientists did in order to make the new way that physical reality appeared align with their mistaken belief in physical objectivity was invent and then adopt a belief regarding the act of observation that basically turned the act of observation into a sort of magic wand that, in some completely unknown and inexplicable way, has the ability to turn one type of physical reality into the completely opposite type of physical reality. And all the scientists except for Einstein went along with the probabilistic interpretation and the new belief used to create it. Not because either makes any sense, but simply because inventing that new belief and then applying that new belief to the new way that physical reality appeared was the only way they could make the new way that physical reality appeared align with the mistaken belief in the objective nature of physical reality that they were not willing to bring into question, because they did not and still do not really see physical objectivity as a belief, but instead see it as the way reality actually is. And by inventing that new and mistaken belief regarding the act of observation and then applying that new and mistaken belief to the new way that physical reality appeared, scientists converted those new physical appearances into a new and deeper delusion in which their individual awarenesses then became trapped, except for Einstein, who steadfastly refused to enter into the probabilistic delusion regarding the nature of physical reality. Now here you might wonder, but why would so many otherwise completely rational, logical, and brilliant scientists so willingly accept a new belief regarding the act of observation that itself has no way of being rationally, logically, or mechanically explained, but instead turns the act of observation into a sort of magic wand that possesses the ability to transmute one type of physical reality into the opposite type of physical reality? And the answer is because once they had used that new and mistaken belief to convert the new way that physical reality appeared into the probabilistic delusion, their awarenesses then began to operate from within that delusion. And while operating from within that new and deeper delusion, the new and mistaken belief regarding what the act of observation was capable of doing no longer appeared as just a belief, because it had become inseparable from the probabilistic delusion it had been used to create. And so then and thereafter appeared as the way reality actually is, and so as the way the act of observation actually operates. And so then and thereafter appeared not as the very changeable belief that it actually is, but instead appeared as an unchanging feature of reality, and so as something that could not and should not be questioned. And so to summarize, scientists dug deeper into the experiential delusion by making the contradictory physical appearances fit their mistaken belief in the objective nature of physical reality, rather than allowing the contradictory appearances to guide them in shaping their belief about the nature of physical reality, because from within the experiential delusion in which they were all operating and still continue to operate, that mistaken belief did not and still does not appear as a belief, but instead appears as the way reality actually is, because that mistaken belief, i.e. the belief that physical reality is in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there, is the mistaken belief that's being used to convert what are only mind-generated physical appearances into the experiential delusion in which most human beings were and remain effectively trapped. And that is a very real and concrete example of the vicious cycle that begins to operate the moment a mistaken belief is applied to some experiential appearance, thereby converting that appearance into a self-perpetuating reality-obscuring delusion that hides from one's awareness the reality that is actually there, while simultaneously disguising the mistaken belief used to create it as the way reality actually is. And so to summarize, all delusions contain and so present two related appearances that appear to exist in a way that is the complete opposite of the way those appearances actually exist. Specifically, the appearance to which the mistaken belief is applied appears as a reality that is actually there, which is the complete opposite of its actual nature. And the mistaken belief appears as the unchanging way reality actually is, which is the complete opposite of its actual nature, inasmuch as belief can always be changed, and a mistaken belief is most certainly not the way reality actually is. And each of those interrelated delusional appearances functions to maintain the other delusional appearance, so that the delusion as a whole becomes a very stable mind creation or mind structure that, once created, becomes very difficult for an awareness to project itself beyond and so escape from. Because once that vicious cycle begins to operate, even when new information arises that should, at the very least, bring the mistaken belief into question, the mistaken belief is not brought into question because it no longer appears as just a belief, and so no longer appears as something that can or should be questioned. And so the new information is either ignored, or when it can't be ignored, is made to fit the mistaken belief by inventing an explanation that itself has no way of being explained. And so it's really not an explanation at all, but just presents the illusion of being an explanation. And that vicious cycle has left human awarenesses for thousands of years trapped in an experiential delusion, because we simply refuse to allow our mistaken belief in the nature of physical reality to be brought into question, which then allows that mistaken belief to keep converting what are only mind-generated appearances into reality-obscuring and self-obscuring delusions that then continue to disguise the belief that is producing those delusions. And on and on and on it goes until here we are, living in a world filled with individual human awarenesses that are becoming increasingly deluded and more detached from reality with each passing day, as they desperately try to escape the suffering that being trapped in a delusional reality always produces, never knowing that they are not escaping that suffering, but are just tunneling deeper into its source. And then they go shoot up a school or perform some other horrible act, and then some other deluded individual tells other deluded people that the shooting or horrible act never really happened, and they believe it because that's what they want to believe, because that's the story or narrative that fits the progressively and so extremely delusional reality they have constructed as a way of escaping their own delusion-induced suffering. But those are just the most extreme cases. Because even if you are a relatively sane human being that has not gone deeply and completely down the rabbit hole of delusion as a result of ingesting the enormous amounts of misinformation and disinformation that is now readily available to human beings thanks to the series of tubes known as the internet, your individual awareness is still, in all likelihood, effectively trapped in a delusional reality that is keeping hidden from your awareness the reality that you really are. And how can you tell whether or not your awareness is effectively trapped in a delusional reality? By whether or not you experience what is known as psychological suffering. Because all psychological suffering, regardless of what appears to be its most proximal cause, has as its ultimate cause the effective entrapment of the awareness that is experiencing that suffering in a delusional reality, where it has been left completely unaware of its true, untouchable, and infinitely badass nature, and so is left to know itself instead as some relatively random set of mind-generated physical and mental appearances that can be fucked with in countless ways. Now at this point, some of you may be thinking, hey, wait a second, I thought this video was supposed to be about the fourth level of relational structure, and here you are yammering on about all kinds of other stuff. What's up with that? I'll tell you what's up with that. This video is primarily about explaining how the formless awareness that's actually there, where physical reality only appears to be, structurally evolves into the fourth level relational structures that are actually there wherever we perceive animated or living matter to be. But this video, like all the videos I have already made and likely will ever make, is also about explaining the situation human beings are in. And part of explaining that situation involves explaining why we have remained stuck in that situation. And for reasons that I just explained, we have remained stuck in the situation we are presently in, unaware of the reality that's both actually there and what we really are, primarily as a result of the difficulties involved in changing what we believe about the nature of the experiential realities in general and physical reality in particular. And so it's not enough for me to just tell you how reality is, which I will get to shortly, but it's also necessary for me to tell you why reality is not the way you have been taught to believe it is. Because as long as you continue to cling to the false beliefs that both produce and are derived from the experiential delusion, you will remain effectively trapped in that delusion, unable to understand how reality actually is and what you really are. Because while operating from within that delusion, it's simply not possible to understand either the actual nature of reality or your own true nature, no matter how clear, detailed, and accurate of an explanation you're given. To return to the magic show analogy, if you had spent your entire life in the audience section of a magic show, mistakenly believing that the illusions created during that magic show were what is actually happening, and then someone ran onto the stage and told you that none of those illusions were what is actually happening, you would not understand them, and you would not believe them, and you would likely just boo them off the stage. On the other hand, if someone stepped onto the stage and told you that none of those illusions were what is actually happening, and was then allowed to show you step by step how all the illusions are being created by a previously hidden and so unseen mechanism, there is then at least a chance that you would begin to question your mistaken belief in the illusions as being what is actually happening, thereby giving you a chance to see past those illusions and into the reality that's actually there, producing those illusions. Because even though the reality you really are, beyond the mind-generated experiential appearances that you mistakenly believe yourself to be, is functioning as both the magician and the audience in this magic show that we call the physical universe, as things stand right now, you are trapped in the audience section of what is ultimately your own magic show. And you are trapped in the audience section of your own magic show because you have made the unavoidable mistake of mistakenly believing that the experiential appearances and so illusions that your mind is producing are realities that are actually there, where only your own formless, timeless, and deathless reality actually is, albeit in a relationally structured form. And in making that unavoidable mistake, you put into motion and so entered into the vicious cycle whereby a mistaken belief produces a delusion that then disguises that mistaken belief as unquestionable and incontrovertible fact, thereby leaving your awareness effectively trapped in a reality obscuring and self-obscuring experiential delusion, because it never occurs to you to question the mistaken belief that is producing the delusion, because from within the delusion it doesn't appear as a belief, but instead appears as the way things actually are, and so doesn't appear as something over which you have any control. And what I'm doing is trying to help you throw a wrench into that vicious cycle by directly challenging the mistaken belief that lies at the heart of the experiential delusion, so that you can see that that mistaken belief is not the way things actually are, but is just a belief, and that as a belief you have the ability to change it. Because if you can change that mistaken belief to a more accurate belief, experiential reality won't go away, which you wouldn't want to happen anyway, at least while still organically alive, but it will stop functioning as a reality obscuring and so self-obscuring delusion, because you will no longer be adding to the experiential appearances the additional conceptual thing that causes the experiential appearances to function as reality obscuring and so self-obscuring delusions. And just to be clear, the mistaken belief that lies at the heart of the experiential delusion is the mistaken belief that the mind-generated physical and mental realities are realities that are actually there. And I'm trying to help you throw a wrench into the vicious cycle in which you are caught up in by explaining in sometimes excruciating detail exactly how the trick is done, which is to say exactly how the formless awareness that you really are causes all that we know as experiential reality to happen and appear. Because there is simply no way to understand how that trick is done while still continuing to believe that physical and mental reality are realities that are actually there. Because the only way to understand how that trick is done is by recognizing that physical and mental reality are mind-generated appearances that are being superimposed by projection and reflection upon the ultimately formless and yet relationally structured reality that is actually there. We have now, at long last, come to the point in this video where I will continue with my description of how the illusion of experiential reality is created by explaining how formless awareness, once it has structurally evolved into the first three levels of relational structure, is able to form a new and unique relation with itself that causes it to function as the fourth level relational structures that are actually there, where we perceive and conceive any bit of living or animated matter to be. And so let's get to it after my usual spiel about how these are not standalone videos but need to be watched in sequence so that your mind possesses the conceptual context necessary to understand the concepts presented in the current video. And that was my spiel, which was mercifully brief this time. And even though from this point on I'm going to assume that anyone watching has seen the previous videos, I'm still going to do a very brief recap of the major concepts presented in the last two videos so we can more easily transition into a description of just what it is that constitutes a fourth level of relational awareness structure. The reality that is actually there, where physical reality appears to be, is also the reality that you really are, and that reality is the formless awareness that is aware of these words. And that formless awareness has structurally evolved into a series of four progressive relational structures as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. Specifically, the first relation formless awareness forms with itself causes it to function as the first level relational awareness structure that is actually there, where we perceive and conceive empty physical space to be. And once formless awareness is functioning as a first level of relational structure, that first level of relational structure is able to form a relatively stable relation with itself, thereby causing formless awareness to also function as a second level of relational awareness structure that emerges and operates within the first level of relational structure. And such second level relational awareness structures are the realities that are actually there, where we perceive and conceive the physical realities of light or electromagnetic radiation to be. And once formless awareness is functioning as a second level of relational structure, second level relational structures are able to form relatively stable relations with other second level relational structures, thereby causing formless awareness to function as a third level of relational awareness structure that also emerges and operates within the first level of relational structure. And such third level relational awareness structures are the realities that are actually there where we perceive and conceive any bit of inanimate matter to be. And if that pattern of iterative and so progressive relation were to continue, next I would be telling you that once formless awareness is functioning as a third level of relational structure, that those third level structures then form relatively stable relations with each other to produce a fourth level of relational awareness structure. But that's not what happens. Third level relational structures are able to form relatively stable relations with other third level relational structures, but those relatively stable relations do not produce a new level of relational structure because those relations do not produce a new way the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality has become stably structured through movement in relation to itself. Instead, what is created when a third level structure forms a relatively stable relation with another third level structure is just a higher order, more compounded and more complex third level relational structure. And third level relational structures forming relatively stable relations with other third level relational structures to form higher order third level structures is how we end up with the periodic table of elements. Because as physical appearances, those elements are not realities that are actually there, because as physical appearances, those elements are just mind-generated etchings of the increasingly compounded and complex third level relational awareness structures that are actually there. And so, if the fourth level of relational structure is not produced by a relation that third level relational structures form with each other, then what is the relation of awareness to itself that produces the fourth level of relational structure? And this is where things start to get interesting. The relations of awareness to itself that produce the first three levels of relational structure can all be referred to as intra-level relations, because each of the first three levels of relational awareness structure emerge as a result of a relation that a particular level of awareness forms with itself. Specifically, what I refer to as the zero level of reality forms a relation with itself at some point within itself and thereby functions as the first level of relational structure. And what I refer to as the zero level of reality refers to the fundamental reality or formless awareness as it is prior to becoming involved in any relation with itself that causes it to function as a relational structure. And once formless awareness is functioning as a first level of relational structure, that first level of relational structure is able to form a relation with itself at various points within itself, thereby causing second level relational structures to emerge and operate within the first level of relational structure. And once formless awareness is functioning as a second level of relational structure, those second level structures are able to form relatively stable relations with other second level structures, thereby causing formless awareness to function as a third level of relational structure that also emerges and operates within the first level of relational structure. And so the relations of formless awareness to itself that produce the first three levels of relational structure are all intra-level relations of awareness to itself, because all the relations just mentioned involve the same level of awareness forming a relation with itself. But the relation of awareness to itself that causes it to function as a fourth level of relational structure cannot be an intra-level relation, because as I have already pointed out, intra-level, third-level relations only produce higher order and more complex third-level relational structures. Therefore, the relatively stable relation that awareness forms with itself to produce and function as a fourth level of relational structure must be the result of an inter-level relation that awareness is able to form with itself, meaning a relation that occurs or exists between two different levels of awareness. And so, since the relation of awareness to itself that produces the fourth level of relational structure must be an inter-level relation, the next question that we have to ask and answer is, what levels of awareness form a relatively stable relation with each other in order to produce and function as the fourth level relational structures that are actually there where living or animated matter appears to be? And clearly, one of those levels is the third level of relational structure, because what we are left with when animated or living matter is no longer being animated and so no longer appears as living matter is inanimate matter, meaning that what we are left with when a fourth level structure stops functioning as a fourth level structure is a third level structure. And so, if third level relational structures make up one component of the relatively stable relation that awareness must form with itself in order to function as a fourth level of relational structure, the next question that we have to ask and answer is, what is the other component of that relation? And specifically, what is the animating component? Because third level relational structures are clearly the structural component of that relation, which is to say, third level structures are clearly the structures that are animated by the animating component, whatever that might be. And by animation, I am referring to mechanical movement that is induced in a third level relational structure beyond the speed of light movement that is already an intrinsic part of its structure, and which additional mechanical movement causes a third level structure to function as a fourth level relational structure for as long as the animating relation holds. And so, all that having been stated, the question we now need to ask and answer is, what level of awareness forms an animating relation with third level relational structures and, in so doing, induces mechanical movement in those structures, thereby causing them to function as the fourth level relational awareness structures that are actually there wherever we perceive and conceive living or animated matter to be. And my working hypothesis at this point is that the level of awareness that forms an animating relation with third level relational structures, causing them to function as fourth level relational structures for as long as that animating relation holds, is the zero level of reality, which is to say formless awareness as it is prior to or in the absence of having formed a relation with itself that causes it to function as a relational structure. And I came to that conclusion because it's the only relation that makes any sense, and also because that relation is so completely self-similar to the relation that human beings have with the clothes that we first create and then animate by entering into and wearing them. And before you conclude that I have completely lost my mind, please allow me to explain. As you will no doubt recall from the 3 previous videos, the physical universe appears fractal in nature because underlying that physical surface appearance is a reality that is structurally evolving through what is an iterative process. And iterative processes are the types of processes that produce the geometric structures that we refer to as fractals. And fractals exhibit a property that is referred to as self-similarity, which means that fundamental patterns tend to be repeated at different levels within a given fractal structure. And I've given examples of such self-similar patterns in other videos. Most notably, I stated that organic cellular structure is a self-similar repetition of the cellular structure that exists at the first level of relational structure, and that mechanical governors are a self-similar repetition of the variable periodic structure of third-level relational structures. And what I'm saying now is that the overall process by which humans manufacture and then wear clothes is a self-similar repetition at a much higher level of iteration of the overall process by which formless awareness structurally evolves to the point where it is then able to enter into and animate a structured form of itself, essentially putting on and wearing a third-level relational structure, which then functions as a fourth-level relational structure for as long as that animating relation holds. And as I will now explain, the similarities between those 2 processes are staggering and are not coincidental. A loom is a device that is used to weave threads into cloth, and that cloth is then sewn into clothes. And then the clothes are entered into, worn, and animated by human beings who, in general, constructed the loom, worked the loom, and also sewed the cloth into clothing. Similarly, the first level of relational structure, which we perceive as empty physical space, functions as a sort of device that is used to weave second-level relational structures, which we perceive as light, into third-level relational structures, which we perceive as inanimate matter. And those third-level relational structures then form relations with each other to produce higher order and more complex third-level structures, which we perceive as higher order and more complex forms of matter. And those higher order and more complex third-level structures are then entered into, worn, and animated by the fundamental reality or formless awareness of which all levels of relational structure are actually composed beyond their physical surface appearances. And so in this analogy, which is far more than an analogy because it is a description of a self-similar pattern that exists within the structure of reality, the first level of relational structure functions as the loom. Second level relational structures function as the threads. Third level relational structures function as the cloth made from those threads. And higher order and more complex third level structures function as the clothes made from that cloth. And then the reality that is actually there functioning as all three levels of relational structure, and so functioning as the loom, the thread, and the cloth, and the clothes, then enters into and animates the clothes it has constructed out of itself, and in so doing forms a new and relatively stable relation with itself. And it is that new, relatively stable and animating relation that the zero level of reality is able to form with relatively complex third level relational structures that causes the fundamental reality to function as the fourth level relational awareness structures that are actually there where we perceive and conceive any bit of living or animated matter to be. Now, there are two ways that the manufacture and wearing of clothes by human beings could be more similar to the manufacture and wearing of third level relational structures by formless awareness. And one of those ways would be if the clothes that human beings made were all made out of human hair rather than plant material or synthetic fibers, because then our bodies would be entering into and wearing clothes that had been constructed out of that same bodily reality. And the other way that the manufacture and wearing of clothes by human beings could be more similar to the manufacture and wearing of third level relational structures by formless awareness would be if the human body was completely invisible and so completely imperceptible. Because in that case, we would see inanimate clothes lying about that suddenly seem to spring to life, until they then, just as suddenly, once again return to just lying about and being inanimate, because the thing that was actually entering into and animating those clothes couldn't be seen. Instead, all that would be seen would be the effect produced as a result of that invisible thing entering into and putting on the clothes, and which effect would be the appearance of previously inanimate clothes suddenly and inexplicably becoming animated and moving about for some finite amount of time until they eventually became inanimate again. And that's all that's happening here. Because what's happening here is that a perceptually invisible reality is entering into and so putting on and animating for some finite amount of time a perceptually visible reality that is ultimately a relationally structured form of its imperceptible and so invisible self. But we don't understand or know that that's what's happening because the reality that's actually there is completely imperceptible. Instead, all that we can see or perceive are physical etchings and appearances that our minds are producing and then superimposing by projection upon the fundamental, experientially invisible, and relationally structured reality that's actually there, and which fundamental and experientially invisible reality is the formless reality that is aware or conscious of all the mind-generated physical etchings. However, even though we can't perceive what's happening to cause matter to appear animated or alive, if you have watched the first 3 videos or read the book, you should now have the ability to conceive what's happening to cause matter to appear animated or alive. And again, what's happening to cause matter to appear animated or alive is that the unperceivable and inconceivable fundamental reality that we refer to as awareness is flowing through and so entering into what are ultimately just relationally structured forms of itself. And that flow of awareness is able to induce mechanical movement within those relationally structured forms of itself, making that flow an animating flow, which is to say a flow that causes additional movement or motion within those relational structures beyond the speed of light movement that is intrinsic to their existence as relational structures. And that animating flow of awareness causes relatively complex third-level relational structures to function as fourth-level relational structures for as long as the zero level of reality or zero level of awareness is able to flow through and animate them, which is never for very long, relatively speaking. Because when a fourth-level structure, for whatever reason, is no longer able to sustain or maintain that animating flow, that fourth level relational structure then reverts back to being a third level relational structure and so appears inanimate or dead and immediately begins to disintegrate into its component third-level structures. But if you are now able to conceive what's actually there and what's actually happening beyond the mind-generated surface appearance that we refer to as the physical universe, and so are able to understand what's actually happening wherever we perceive and conceive life or living matter to be, then you should now be able to understand that nothing is ever really alive or dead, because it's all life, because all of reality beyond the physical surface appearance is composed and constructed of the same reality that we can't perceive but have always conceived as the life force, or as that which animates matter, causing it for some finite period of time to appear to be alive. And so what we perceive and conceive as animated or living matter is just the teeniest, tiniest tip of a relationally structured iceberg that is composed entirely of that which is life itself. Because life itself is the formless, timeless, uncreated, and undying awareness of which the entire universe is composed beyond its physical surface appearance. And that beginningless and endless life is not only what's actually there where the physical universe appears to be, but is also what you really are, beyond whatever mind-generated physical and mental forms you presently mistakenly believe yourself to be. Because what you really and truly are is the formless awareness that is flowing through and animating the relationally structured form of yourself that you perceive and conceive as your physical body. And the formless awareness that is flowing through and animating what you perceive and conceive as your physical body is in no way separable nor divisible from the formless awareness of which the entire universe is actually constructed and composed beyond its mind-generated physical surface appearance. However, the formless awareness that is flowing through and animating what you perceive and conceive as your physical body, and which formless awareness is what you really and truly are, has become individualized as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of its own reality. And what I mean by the term individualized, I am now going to explain in some detail, because understanding what the term individualized means with regard to formless awareness as it flows through and animates a relationally structured form of itself will make it possible for you to understand the situation that the reality that you really are has placed itself in as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself that possesses a mind that has the ability to produce the two experiential appearances that you are aware of and refer to as physical and mental reality. And the first thing that you need to understand about the term individualized as it pertains to the situation you are in is that the word individual does not mean what you most likely think it means, because the word individual, as it is presently defined, is meant to indicate realities that are in some way truly separate and distinct from other individual realities. And physical reality does appear to be composed of realities or objects that seem to be separable and distinct from each other, with clear lines where one reality ends and another begins. But the fact is, at the level of what's actually there, which means at the level of relationally structured reality, there is no such thing as a reality that exists separate and distinct from any other reality, because at the level of relational structure, there is no clear line where one reality ends and another begins, because at the level of relational structure, there's just a single reality that has formed a series of iterative and so progressive relations with itself. Put another way, at the level of relational structure, there is no such thing as a truly separate and distinct reality. Therefore, at the level of relational structure, there is nothing whatsoever that corresponds to the word individual as it is presently defined as meaning, and so as it is presently used, which is to indicate a reality that is in some way truly separate and distinct from other realities. And what that means is that the definition of the word individual as it is presently defined as meaning, and so as it is presently used, pertains only to mind-generated physical reality and does not pertain to reality as it actually is beyond that mind-generated surface appearance, and therefore does not pertain to what actually is, but only pertains to what appears to be. And it makes perfect sense that the word individual, as it is presently defined as meaning, and so as it is presently used, pertains only to mind-generated physical reality and not to reality as it actually is beyond that mind-generated surface appearance, inasmuch as human awarenesses have been and remain effectively trapped in mind-generated experiential appearances turned experiential delusions, completely unaware of the indivisible and inseparable reality that is both actually there and what they really are. However, since here we are trying to understand what the word individual or individualized means with respect to the situation that the reality that we really are is actually in, we need to dispense with the definition of the word individual that derives from the level of physical appearances, where objects appear as seemingly separate and distinct realities, and instead redefine that word as it applies to reality as it actually is beyond that mind-generated surface appearance. And that won't be hard to do because the word itself tells us what it means at that level, as words so often do. And what the word individual means as it pertains to indivisible and yet relationally structured reality is a reality that is functioning as one pole of an indivisible duality. It's right there in the word, individual, i.e. indivisible duality. For example, this drawing shows both poles of an indivisible duality, and up until now I've been using this drawing to indicate the relation that the fundamental reality forms with itself as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. But now we are going to examine this same drawing to see what it tells us about the word individual as it pertains to relationally structured reality, which is to say, as it pertains to the fundamental reality as it is functioning while moving in relation to itself, and so while being in relation to itself. And what this drawing shows, as already stated, is both poles of what is an indivisible duality. And each pole of that indivisible duality is an individual reality, but they are not individual realities as the word individual is normally used, which is to indicate realities that have an existence that is separate and distinct from each other. Instead, each of these two realities, which are usually referred to as yin and yang, is an individual reality in the way that I have just defined and so redefined the word individual to mean as it pertains to realities as they actually exist beyond the mind-generated illusion termed illusion that we refer to as physical reality. Because the way those individual realities actually exist, and the way all individual realities actually exist, at the level of what's actually there, is as one pole of what is always an indivisible duality. Put another way, at the level of what's actually there, no individual reality is as it is, separate and apart from the rest of reality. Because at the level of what's actually there, any reality only is what it is as a function of the relation in which it is involved with the other pole of its indivisible duality. Because it is that relation that causes what is an indivisible reality to function as an indivisible duality that consists of two individual realities, which is to say, as the two individual poles of what is always and so remains an indivisible duality and so indivisible reality. For example, the first level of relational structure has both a structural aspect and a dynamic aspect. The structural aspect is its cellular structure, and the dynamic aspect is the speed of light exchange of reality cell content that continuously takes place between its cellular components. And so each of those aspects is an individual aspect of the first level of relational structure, and so each aspect is one pole of an indivisible duality, inasmuch as neither individual aspect has any existence in the absence of the other individual aspect. Likewise, second level relational structures also have two individual aspects or components. Specifically, they have a maximal distortion component and a less than maximal distortion component. And each of those two components is an individual aspect of an indivisible duality because, once again, neither individual aspect has any existence whatsoever absent the other individual aspect, because each individual aspect only exists as an individual aspect as a function of a relation in which it is involved with the other pole of its indivisible duality. And so here's the thing about individuality as it exists at the level of what's actually there. What we refer to as an individual reality, which is always just one pole of an indivisible duality, has no individual existence and so no individuality outside the context of the existence of the other individual pole of that same indivisible duality, meaning that neither individual pole is in any way separable or divisible from from the other individual pole. And so, referring to a single pole of an indivisible duality as an individual reality is an accurate way of indicating one pole of an indivisible duality, but only so long as we dispense with the physical and so appearance-based definition of the word individual that implies some actually existent divisibility and separation, and instead understand and recognize that the word individual, as it applies to reality as it actually is beyond the physical surface appearance, rather than indicating or implying separation or division, instead implies inseparability and indivisibility, and specifically indicates or implies an inseparability and indivisibility that must exist between the individual reality that is being indicated or pointed toward using the word individual and the other individual pole of that same indivisible duality. Put another way, at the level of what's actually there, no individual reality actually exists in the way that the word individual is presently defined as meaning, which is as a reality that somehow exists separate and apart from other realities. Instead, at the level of what's actually there, individual realities only exist as individual realities through ongoing relation to the other individual pole of that particular indivisible duality. And so, in the final analysis, what the word individual indicates is not some separation or division that exists between realities. Instead, what the word individual indicates is only some relative difference that exists between the two mutually coexistent poles of what is ultimately a single indivisible reality. And because what the word individual actually indicates is a relative difference, it does not indicate separation or two-ness, but instead indicates an unseen connection and oneness. And so what the word individual actually indicates is some relative difference absent any actual divisibility. And while we may not see that connection, oneness, and indivisibility in the mind-generated etchings of relationally structured reality that we refer to as physical reality, it is still always there at the level of reality that is the basis of those etchings. And the reason I am taking so much time going into what the word individual means as it pertains to reality as it actually is beyond the physical surface appearance is because understanding how formless awareness becomes individualized and so functions as an individual awareness as a result of flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure is central to understanding how the infinite, indivisible, and formless reality that you really are comes to inadvertently and unknowingly cage itself within a mind-generated experiential environment through mistaken belief in the nature of that experiential environment, and specifically by mistakenly believing physical and mental reality to be realities that are actually there, when all they really are just mind-generated appearances that are being superimposed by projection and reflection on the formless and yet relationally structured and so structurally differentiated and yet indivisible awareness that is both actually there and what you really are. And now, having redefined the word individual as it applies to non-apparent reality, next we will look at how indivisible awareness becomes individualized as a result of flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure. However, before we do that, I should mention that at this point we are not concerned with the mechanics of precisely how the zero level of reality induces mechanical movement in a third level structure, thereby causing it to function as a fourth level structure. To be honest, I don't know exactly how that happens. All that I know is that that must be what is happening for third level structures to function as fourth level structures. And what I also know is that in order for mechanical movement to be produced in third level structures, thereby causing them to function as fourth level structures, such third level structures must possess a structure that allows them to function as an opening through which the zero level of reality can flow, which is why a certain degree of structural complexity is necessary before the fourth level or animating relation between the zero level of reality and the third level of relational structure can take place. That is, the animating relation that takes place between the zero level of reality and relatively complex third level relational structures, thereby producing a fourth level of relational structure, is not a relation that is analogous to the water in a river flowing past a pebble or rock that lies within it. That relation is always present at every level of relationally structured reality. because all relationally structured reality arises, emerges, and so exists within the river of formless awareness that I sometimes refer to as the zero level of reality, and which Lao Tzu referred to as the Tao. This entire universe is just a swirl that arises at some point within the infinite and endless river of awareness, where that river turns and flows in relation to itself, and in so flowing functions as the first level of relational structure that we physically perceive as the vastness of empty physical space. And then that first level swirl repeats or reiterates the process that created it as a relational structure by forming a relation with itself at various points within itself, thereby causing what is still just a single reality to also function as second level relational structures or second level swirls. And then those second level swirls reiterate the process of self-relation by forming relations with each other to produce third level structures or swirls. And then those third level swirls form relations with each other to produce increasingly compounded and complex third level swirls. And all of those different levels of swirls are both composed of the river of formless awareness and also emerge and so exist within that river of formless awareness, or zero level of reality. And so the river of formless awareness is always flowing past the swirls that arise within it, just as river water flows past the swirls that arise within it, while at the same time that same flow of water is also producing those swirls by forming a relation with itself. But here's the wild thing. At some point, the third level swirls become structurally complex enough so that the zero level of awareness doesn't just flow past them, but also becomes able to flow through them. And by becoming able to flow through those third level swirls or third level structures, the zero level of awareness is able to somehow induce mechanical movement in those third level swirls or structures beyond the movement that is intrinsic to their relational structure. And by flowing through and inducing mechanical movement in those third level swirls or structures, the zero level of awareness animates those structures and so brings them to what we perceive and conceive as life, even though, as I said before, it's all life, because the same formless reality that animates matter and so brings it to life is the same formless reality of which everything is actually composed beyond the physical surface appearance. And the new animating relation that formless awareness is able to form with itself, once third level structures evolve to a certain degree of structural complexity, opens up an entirely new avenue of structural evolution that formless awareness then takes by continuing to form iterative and so progressive relations with itself at the fourth level of relational structure, and which iterative and progressive fourth level relations we perceive and conceive as organic evolution, or the evolution of what we call life. And so what we perceive and conceive as the evolution of life is just the continuation of the same evolutionary process that brings into being the first, second, and third levels of relational structure. And that same evolutionary process is the progressive structural evolution of formless awareness that takes place as a result of that singular and fundamental reality forming iterative and so progressive relations with itself. And the only twist along the way in that process is the unique interlevel animating relation that formless awareness forms with itself to bring into being the fourth level of relational structure. But that's still a relation of awareness to itself. It's just a relation of unstructured awareness to relationally structured awareness. Keeping in mind that relationally structured awareness is just unstructured awareness that has become involved in a stable pattern of movement relative to itself. In any case, the fourth level or animating relation opens up an entirely new avenue of structural evolution, because once fourth level relational structures emerge within the structure of reality, the same process that brings all four levels of relational structure into being then operates upon fourth level relational structures, causing those fourth level structures to structurally evolve through iterative and progressive self-relation. Specifically, the fourth level of relational structure likely begins at what we physically perceive as the molecular level, which is to say, it is likely that it is at the molecular level that third level structures become structurally complex enough to function as an opening through which the zero level of awareness can flow in order to animate those structures and bring them to life, so to speak, thereby causing them to function as fourth level structures for as long as that animating relation continues. And then those fourth level molecules form relations with other molecules to produce the higher order fourth level structures that we perceive and conceive as prokaryotic cells, which are living or animated cells that do not contain a nucleus. And then those prokaryotic cells form a relation with themselves to produce the higher order and more highly iterated fourth level structures that we perceive and conceive as eukaryotic cells, which are living or animated cells that do contain a nucleus. And then eukaryotic cells form relations with other eukaryotic cells to produce multicellular fourth level structures. And then multicellular fourth level structures form relations with themselves and in so doing become internally differentiated and so begin to possess what we perceive and conceive as different organs. And at every level of fourth level relational structure, from the molecular to the most highly evolved multicellular organism, those fourth level structures are only able to remain integrated as structures as a result of the animating flow of the zero level of awareness through them. Because the moment a fourth level structure is no longer able to function as an opening through which the zero level of awareness can flow, that animating flow is no longer able to take place, and those previously integrated structures then immediately begin to disintegrate into their component and now unanimated third level structures. And so as you look at the world around you, everything you perceive and conceive as being organically alive is, beyond its physical surface appearance, a fourth level relational awareness structure that is being animated and so kept alive as a result of the zero level of reality or zero level of awareness flowing through it. And your physical body is one of those fourth level relational awareness structures. And the formless awareness that is aware of that physical body is the formless awareness that is flowing through and animating that body. And that formless awareness is what you really are and is also what everything else really is as well, beyond the physical surface appearance. However, the formless awareness that you really are, by flowing through and animating the fourth level relational structure that you perceive and conceive as your physical body, has become individualized. And in order to understand the situation that the reality that you really are has placed itself in as a result of flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure, you need to understand exactly what it means for awareness to become individualized. And in order to explain what it means for awareness to become individualized, all I need to do is explain how awareness becomes individualized as a result of flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a very simple analogy because the process of individualization is very simple. If a drinking straw is submerged in a river parallel to the direction of flow of that river, some portion of the river water will always be flowing through that straw. And the presence of the straw in a river in that way, so that some of the river water is always flowing through it, produces an indivisible duality within the river between the river water that is flowing through the straw and all the rest of the river water that is not flowing through the straw. And that's because a relative difference and so differentiation now exists between the river water that is flowing through the straw and the river water that is not flowing through the straw. It's still all the same river, but now the water of which the river is composed has formed a relation with itself as a result of the straw that now exists within it. And that relation is the relation that now exists between the water that is and is not flowing through the straw. And so the water that flows through the straw, as it flows through the straw, is different from and so distinguishable from the water that is not flowing through the straw. But that difference and distinguishability is not a function of any actual difference or division that exists between what's flowing within the straw and what's flowing outside the straw, because it's all still the same river water reality. Instead, that difference and distinguishability only exists as a function of a structure that now exists within the river that causes the river to form a relation with itself and so causes the river to exist as an indivisible duality that is composed of two individual poles, one of which is the river water that is flowing through the straw, and the other of which is all the rest of the river water that is not flowing through the straw. And so, By doing nothing more than submerging a straw in a river, we cause that river to undergo a process that can be referred to as individualization, because owing to the ongoing presence of the straw in the river, an indivisible duality now exists in the river between the individual portion of the river water that is flowing through the straw and the individual portion of the river water that is not flowing through the straw. And so, owing to the presence of the straw in the river, a relative difference and so real differentiation now exists between that single river reality as it flows through the straw and as it is not flowing through the straw. And that relative difference and so real differentiation exists because the individual portion of water that's flowing through the straw as it flows through the straw exists in and encounters an environment that is different than the environment that the individual portion of water that is not flowing through the straw exists in and encounters. And in an analogous way, and really in the exact same way, the emergence of relatively complex third-level structures that the zero level of awareness can flow through and animate, thereby producing a fourth level of relational structure, causes the zero level of awareness to undergo a process of individualization. And that's because, owing to the ongoing presence of any fourth level relational structure, an indivisible duality then exists within the zero level of awareness between the individual portion and pole of awareness that is flowing through a particular fourth level structure and the individual portion and pole of awareness that is not flowing through that particular fourth level structure. And just like a river that's been individualized by placing a straw in it, it's all still the same zero level of awareness, whether it is or is not flowing through a fourth level structure. But owing to the presence of fourth level structures, a relative difference and so real differentiation now exists between the zero level of awareness as it flows through a particular fourth level structure and as it is not flowing through that particular fourth level structure. And that's because the individual portion of awareness that's flowing through a particular fourth level structure as it flows through that fourth level structure temporarily exists in, encounters, and so becomes aware of an environment that is different than the environment that any other individual portion of awareness that is not flowing through that particular fourth level structure exists in, encounters, and becomes aware of. And so, when I refer to the individualization of awareness, or to your awareness as being an individual awareness, I am not indicating any actual separation or division that exists between your individual awareness and the rest of reality. Instead, I am using the term individual awareness only to indicate that the reality that you really are, by flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure, has formed a relation with itself as a result of that animating flow, and in so doing has become individualized into two poles of what is an indivisible duality. And one pole of that indivisible duality is the individual awareness that is flowing through and animating the fourth level relational structure that you perceive and conceive as your physical body. And the other pole of that same indivisible duality is all the rest of the river of awareness that is not flowing through and animating the fourth level relational structure that you perceive and conceive as your physical body. And even though the reality that you really are is equally both poles of that indivisible duality of awareness, and is not really more one pole than the other, the reality that you really are has nonetheless effectively trapped itself in the individual pole of awareness that is flowing through and animating what is ultimately just a relationally structured form of itself, and in so doing has effectively trapped itself in the audience section of the magic show that we call the universe, even though the reality that you really are is functioning in that magic show as both the magician and the audience. And the reality that you really are has effectively trapped itself in the audience section of its own magic show by effectively trapping an individual portion of its awareness within the confines of the experiential environment that is able to be produced by the fourth level relational structure that that individual portion of its awareness is flowing through and animating. And the indivisible and yet individualized reality that you really are has effectively trapped a portion of its awareness within the confines of an experiential environment by doing nothing more than becoming and remaining mistakenly aware of what are only experiential appearances as being realities that are actually there. And that effective entrapment is able to take place because the fourth level relational awareness structure that your individual pole of awareness is flowing through and animating also possesses a very highly evolved and specialized fourth level organ or structure that we call a mind. And your individual pole of awareness is also flowing through and animating that specialized fourth level structure of mind. And that animating flow makes it possible for your mind to produce the two completely different and yet related sets of experiential appearances that we refer to as physical and mental reality, one of which the mind produces by external projection, and the other of which it produces by internal reflection. And the environment that your individual pole of awareness becomes aware of as a result of flowing through and animating your body and mind are the physical and mental experiential appearances that your mind is producing, as well as any emotional appearances that are also being produced as a result of that animating flow. And that physical, mental, and emotional experiential environment is completely unique to your individual pole of awareness, because only your mind and your mind alone is producing the projected and reflected appearances that you become aware of as physical and mental reality. And only your individual flow of awareness and your individual flow alone is producing what you become aware of as your emotional reality. And while most people are aware that their mental and emotional realities are individual and so unique to them, not many are aware that their physical reality is just as unique and just as individual, because most people mistakenly believe that physical reality is what's actually there, where it appears to be. But regardless of what people mistakenly believe the nature of physical reality to be, physical reality remains what it really is. And what physical reality really is an appearance that is being created by your mind and then projected onto the relational awareness structures that are actually there, where physical reality then appears to be. However, because of the way that our minds create physical reality, which is by forming impactive relations with the relational awareness structures that are actually there, and because we all possess the same type of mind, i.e. a human mind, our minds all produce physical appearances that appear essentially the same when forming impactive relations with the same relational structures. And that situation creates an illusion that makes it possible for us to come to the mistaken conclusion and so produce the delusion that we are all aware of the same physical reality while all looking at or toward what we mistakenly believe is the same physical reality, but which seemingly same physical reality is really a unique but similar appearance that each of our minds is creating by forming an individual and so unique impactive relation with whatever relational structure is actually there, where the projected physical reality appears to be. And so what I'm saying is that if a million people are all simultaneously looking up at a full moon, they may all believe they are all aware of the same full moon, but they really aren't. What they are all doing is looking at or toward the same gigantic third level relational structure that's actually there where the moon appears to be, so that each of their individual minds then forms an impactive relation with the light or second level structures that are reflecting off of that gigantic third level structure. And as a result, each of their individual minds produces a physical appearance that has essentially the same appearance, leading them all to mistakenly conclude that they are all aware of the same physical reality. But what each of them becomes aware of and experiences as the physical reality that we refer to as the moon isn't what's actually there, but is actually a unique and individually created physical appearance that each of their individual minds is creating and then superimposing by projection upon the relationally structured awareness that is actually there where the full moon appears to be. And so what I'm saying is that if a million people are all looking up at a full moon, there are actually a million different physical moon appearances being created by a million different minds. And each of those million different minds is being animated by an individual flow of awareness that is individually aware of the unique physical moon appearance that is being created by the individual mind it is flowing through and animating. And the same thing applies to every physical reality of which any individual awareness has ever been aware, because they're all just mind-generated appearances that are all created as the result of an individual mind forming either a direct or indirect impactive relation with the relational structure that's actually there where the projected physical appearance ends up appearing to be, so that it then ends up being mistaken for being the reality that's actually there. And the individual uniqueness of physical reality is not at all hard to understand. once you are able to accept the fact that physical reality is just a mind-generated appearance and so is not the reality that's actually there. On the other hand, the individual uniqueness of physical reality is impossible to understand if you refuse to accept the fact that physical reality is just a mind-generated appearance and instead continue to mistakenly believe that physical reality is, in some way, shape, or form, the reality that's actually there. And if you want to continue to believe that physical reality is in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there, then by all means continue to do so. You are the fundamental reality, and as such, you are free to believe whatever you want to believe, regardless of how absolutely and fundamentally wrong that belief may be. I am not here to tell you how to live or what you should or should not think or believe. All I'm here to do is explain how reality is structured and how it functions in order to provide you with the opportunity to become aware of the cause and effect consequences of what you choose to think and believe. That's all. And as an individual awareness that is flowing through and animating a human body and mind, you are flowing through and animating a relational structure that has the ability to produce the two related and yet completely different sets of experiential appearances that you are aware of as physical and mental reality. And as long as you continue to take part in that animating relation, meaning as long as you are organically alive, you have no choice but to become individually aware of the experiential environment that is produced as a result of your individual and animating flow through that structure. However, although as an individual flow of awareness you have no choice but to become aware of the experiential environment that your animating flow is helping to produce, you do have a choice with regard to what you believe regarding the nature of that experiential environment. And what I'm trying to make as clear as possible is that what you choose to believe regarding the nature of that experiential environment is everything. Because what you choose to believe regarding the nature of that experiential environment affects everything. Because that choice determines the realities that you, as an individual flow of awareness, can and cannot become aware of while flowing through and animating a human mind and body. Specifically, if you mistakenly believe the experiential appearances that make up your experiential environment to be realities that are actually there, then that mistaken belief converts those experiential appearances into an experiential delusion that then functions as the walls of a cage in which your individual flow of awareness becomes effectively trapped and in which it then suffers. Because by mistakenly believing what are only mind-generated experiential appearances to be realities that are actually there, you obscure from your awareness the reality that is actually there, and so obscure from your awareness the reality that you really are. And so, by choosing to believe that the experiential appearances are realities that are actually there, you are left with no choice but to become and remain aware of both yourself and the universe in a way that is completely delusional, and so in a way that causes you to suffer, because you are then, in effect, driving while blindfolded, because you are then operating and guiding the relational structure you are flowing through and animating while unaware of, and so while functionally cut off from, but never really cut off from, the infinite awareness, intelligence, and love that is all around you as the other pole of your indivisible awareness duality. The one place you can never see directly is the place or point you are seeing from, and the point of awareness you can never be directly aware of is the point of awareness from which you are being aware of reality. And the point of awareness from which you are being aware of reality is the focalized and so individualized point of awareness that is flowing through and animating the fourth level relational structure that is actually there where your physical body appears to be. But it doesn't matter that you can't be aware of the point of awareness from which you are being aware, because the exact same reality is all around you and everywhere, and you can become aware of that reality. Unless, of course, you have made the mistake of believing the experiential appearances to be realities that are actually there, in which case you can still become aware of that reality, except you never do because you never try to project your awareness beyond those now delusional appearances. Because why would you? Because you are completely convinced that you are already aware of the reality that's actually there. We very much and really do each live in a bubble, and that bubble is the individual mind we are each flowing through, animating and illuminating with our individual awareness. And although we do not have to live our organic lives with our individual awareness confined to that bubble, we do live our organic lives with our individual awareness confined to that bubble when we believe the experiential appearances that arise on the surface of that bubble to be realities that are actually there. Because when we do that, the transparent surface of that bubble becomes non transparent to our awareness, thereby converting what is supposed to be a vehicle for self awareness and self enjoyment into a prison where our individual awareness ends up inadvertently torturing itself by unknowingly flowing against itself while trying to find itself. Something is missing, something has been lost. But what is missing and what has been lost is not some physical or mental thing, but is our awareness of our own reality and self. But since the only things we are aware of while trapped in a mind bubble are physical, mental, and emotional things, we search for what seems to be missing in those created appearances and always come up short. And so go off in search of more of the same, hoping that that will do it. But it never does, at least for very long, because those experiential things aren't what's really missing. And the irony and absurdity is, it is our complete attention and devotion to the experiential realities, trying to find what seems to be missing in them, that causes what is actually missing to remain missing, which is to say, hidden from our awareness, because we never look anywhere else because we don't know of any reality other than the experiential realities. You see, contrary to the Garden of Eden mythology, we never really got thrown out of paradise. We just functionally and so effectively got thrown out of paradise by blinding ourselves to our own reality, by choosing to believe that the experiential appearances that our minds are producing are realities that are actually there. That's all. And since that's the situation, all we have to do to unblind ourselves and become aware of our own reality, and thereby re enter the paradise we never really left but just became unaware of, is stop choosing to believe in the experiential appearances in the mistaken way that causes them to function as self obscuring delusions. But that's easier said than done, at least initially, because to make that choice, you first have to become aware that that choice is even possible. And that's not an easy thing to become aware of while your individual awareness is effectively trapped in the delusional reality that is being created by your mistaken belief in the experiential appearances as being realities that are actually there. Because as I explained in the first part of this video, from within the experiential delusion, that mistaken belief does not appear as a belief, but instead appears as the way reality actually is, and so doesn't appear something over which you have any control. And so you just leave it alone, never knowing that if you just start pulling on that one thread, that the whole cocoon of delusion and confusion that you have unknowingly woven around your awareness will begin to unravel, because that mistaken belief, disguised as unquestionable fact, is what holds it all together, because without it, there is no delusion. And so escape from the experiential delusion is relatively easy once you know what to do. It's recognizing what needs to be done that is the sticking point, because we are operating from within a self-created delusion where what we need to do to escape the delusion and the suffering it produces appears as something that we can't do anything about. And so we do everything else instead, and then wonder why life continues to suck so very much despite all our efforts to make it not suck. Now, that's not to say that once you begin to free yourself from the experiential delusion, that things will always go the way you want them to. There will always be things that will happen in a way that you would have preferred to have happened differently or not at all. That's organic life, and there's no getting around it. The difference is, once you are no longer completely trapped in the experiential delusion, you no longer react to every unwanted happening in a way that produces even more unwantedness and more suffering, because you are no longer driving while completely blindfolded. Hell isn't a place you get sent after you die for being an asshole while alive. What hell is the delusional experiential environment you are effectively forced to operate within while mistakenly believing the experiential appearances to be realities that are actually there, because that mistaken belief leaves your localized individual pole of awareness as it flows through and animates your individual body and mind, unaware of its complementary non-localized individual pole. And that complementary non-localized individual pole of awareness, which is all the rest of the infinity of awareness that is not flowing through and animating your individual body and mind, is the reality that the words kingdom of heaven, nirvana, inner self, and soul actually refer to. And that reality is just as much your true self and nature as is the localized individual pole of awareness that is flowing through and animating your body and mind. And the deeper you are trapped within a delusional experiential environment, the more effectively cut off you are from any awareness of that non localized pole of your true self and nature. And the more effectively cut off you are from any awareness of that non localized pole, the more you suffer. And the more you suffer, the more you will cause others to suffer, causing you to function as an even bigger asshole. Even though no matter how much you suffer and no matter how big of an asshole you function as, you're always the same timeless, deathless, and untouchable reality you always have been and always will be, but only ever really are now. You just aren't aware of what you really are because, through mistaken belief, you have unknowingly converted what are just created appearances into seemingly impenetrable, self obscuring walls, and so have inadvertently converted a transparent bubble into the seemingly impenetrable walls of a cage where your individual pole of awareness then spends its organic life engaging in the futile, self defeating, and so comically tragic effort to find what seems to be missing in the very realities that are obscuring what is actually missing. And as long as you continue to mistakenly believe the experiential appearances to be realities that are actually there, your localized individual awareness will, in all likelihood, unless you happen across a true spiritual teacher, continue to make no attempt to penetrate beyond those experiential appearances and into the non-localized pole of awareness that is actually there. Because why would you? Because you mistakenly believe you're already aware of the reality that's actually there, and also mistakenly see your mistaken belief as the way reality actually is. And that is how the vicious cycle that is produced by the horribly effective synergy that exists between mistaken beliefs and the delusions they produce is able to cause your localized individual awareness to continue to make a choice that keeps your individual awareness effectively confined within the environment bounded by those now delusional experiential appearances, where you then suffer. Because from within the delusional environment that you have inadvertently created and so are operating from within, you are not even aware that you are making a choice with regard to what you believe about the nature of the experiential appearances. And so you just keep making the same choice because from within the delusion, there seems to be no choice, even though there is another option, and so another path to go down, which is to say, there is another, more accurate way to view mind generated experiential reality that does not convert it into a self obscuring delusion. And here we get to the crux and nub of the whole self obscuring situation. Everyone uses the term reality, and almost no one knows what it actually means. A reality is anything that the fundamental reality can be aware of. That's all. If you can be aware of it, it's a reality. End of story. A complete hallucination is a reality to the individual awareness that is aware of it, and is not a reality to all the other individual awarenesses that are not aware of it. And so the important question is not whether or not something is a reality, because if you are aware of it, that question has already been answered, because its existence as a reality is then self-evident and so is not in question. Instead, the important question is, what kind of reality is it? And that's because there are two kinds of realities of which awareness, or the fundamental reality, can be aware. And so every reality of which you are aware must be one of those two kinds of realities. And the two kinds of realities of which awareness can be aware are the reality that is actually there, which is itself, and realities that are just appearances that are created by and exist within itself. And so anything you are aware of as a reality is either a created appearance or the reality that is actually there. And when you are presented with an appearance and have no other information, you are going to mistakenly assume and so believe that the appearance is the reality that's actually there, because that's how it appears and presents itself. And by assuming that and believing that, you make a choice whether you know it or not, because there is another option, even if you are not aware of it. And that other option is to instead assume and believe that the reality that appears to actually be there is not the reality that is actually there, but is just an appearance that is being superimposed upon the reality that is actually there. But in order to choose that other option, you need to learn to discriminate between the real and the unreal. And in order to learn to discriminate between the real and the unreal, you first need to become aware that the real and unreal both exist as realities, and then become aware of which is which. The real and the unreal are both realities because they are both things that we can be aware of. The real is the reality that is actually there, and the unreal is everything else, which means all the created appearances that are not actually there, but only appear to actually be there. That's why they're unreal, because they're realities that aren't or aren't really there, where they appear to be. And as hard as it may be to accept at this point, it is simply the case that everything that most human beings presently consider to be real is actually unreal. And the one thing that is real, most human beings are not aware of at all. That is the situation we are in. Localized individual awareness is effectively trapped in mind-generated unreal realities, completely unaware of the one real reality that is both actually there and what we really are. And you will remain effectively trapped in an unreal reality until you learn that there are two types of realities of which you can become aware: created appearances and the actual, and until you learn which is which. Put another way, you have to learn that just because you are able to be aware of a reality doesn't make it a real reality, which is to say, the reality that's actually there. And that's because you can't tell what kind of reality a reality is just by being aware of it, because created appearances, i.e., unreal realities, always appear as realities that are actually there, i.e., as real realities. Physical reality does appear to be the reality that's actually there. No one is denying that. What I am denying is that it is the reality that's actually there, because what I am in the process of explaining and demonstrating in this series of videos is that physical reality is just a created appearance, and so is an unreal reality that is being superimposed by projection upon the relationally structured reality that is actually there, i.e., the real reality. Very young children will believe pretty much anything you tell them, no matter how fantastical. And as individual awarenesses, we enter into these bodies like very young children, and we believe the story that physical reality tells us, i.e., that it is the reality that is actually there, because that's how it appears. And believing that story works up to a point, because believing that story helps us to navigate the relationally structured environment we must operate within while flowing through and animating these bodies. But believing that story has a significant downside, and that downside is that our belief in that story obscures from our individual awarenesses our own reality, i.e., the real reality. In the same way, as long as you continue to believe that a dude wearing a red suit brought presents at a certain time of year, you remained unaware of where presents really came from, because belief in that false story obscured from your awareness the actuality. Likewise, as long as you continue to believe that physical and mental realities are realities that are actually there, you will remain unaware of what you really are, because belief in those false stories obscures from your awareness the reality that is both actually there and what you really are, leaving your individual awareness effectively trapped in a mind-generated unreal reality that you mistakenly know as what is real, all that is real, and what you really are. How can you possibly learn to discriminate between the real and the unreal when all you know and are aware of is the unreal, which is to say, realities that are just created appearances? The answer is you can't. It's just not possible. And so the first step toward freeing yourself from the experiential cage in which you are, in all likelihood, effectively trapping your individual awareness, is to stop making the mistake of believing that what are only created appearances are realities that are actually there. So you can at least become aware that there is another reality there that you can become aware of, should you choose to do so. There's not much in this world that I take all that seriously, given the absurdity of our present situation. But I am very serious about this. I am explaining to you step by step, in sometimes extreme and excruciating detail, exactly how the formless, timeless, deathless, and infinite reality that you really are has managed to effectively confine itself within a completely delusional experiential environment by doing nothing more than attaching a mistaken belief to the experiential appearances that are being produced by the mind that you are flowing through and animating. And you may not like that I'm referring to your experiential environment as being completely delusional, but if you believe that physical reality is the reality that's actually there, then that is a delusion, because it's not. And if you believe that you are a person named so and so, then that is also a delusion, because you are not. What you are is the formless and fundamental reality out of which the entire universe has been constructed and of which it is composed, beyond its physical surface appearance. But you are that reality as it is flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself. And so you are that reality functioning in a state of individualization, which is to say, in a state of relation to itself where it is functioning as two poles of an indivisible duality. And the reality that you really are is both poles of that indivisible duality. But the individual pole of that indivisible duality that is flowing through and animating what you perceive and conceive as your human body and mind has inadvertently and unknowingly limited itself to being aware of only one kind of reality, and specifically has limited itself to being aware of the kind of reality that is just a created appearance, and so is actually an unreality. And so unrealities are all you know, and so unrealities are naturally what you consider to be both what is really real and what you really are. But created appearances remain unrealities no matter what type of realities you believe them to be, because mistaken belief does not change the nature of unrealities. It only changes what you become aware of as their nature, and specifically causes you to become mistakenly aware of them as being realities that are actually there. And by doing that, mistaken belief effectively limits and so effectively changes what you can become aware of as reality by effectively obscuring from your awareness the reality that is actually there, where the created appearance or unreal reality still only appears to be. And mistaken belief in an unreal reality effectively obscures the reality that is actually there from your awareness, not because it actually changes what you can and cannot become aware of, but only because it effectively changes what you can and cannot become aware of. And mistaken belief in an unreal reality effectively changes what you can and cannot become aware of, because that mistaken belief has the effect of causing you to make no effort to project your awareness beyond the now mistakenly conceived unreal reality, leaving you perpetually unaware of the real reality, i.e., the reality that is actually there. In the next video, I will explain how our minds produce the two related and yet completely different sets of experiential appearances that we are aware of and refer to as physical and mental reality. And in that video, I will explain that physical reality functions as a sort of mind-generated map of the relationally structured terrain in which we must operate while flowing through and animating what we perceive and conceive as our physical bodies. And that mental reality or conceptual reality is an additional connect-the-dots appearance that is created by our minds and then superimposed upon or over the physical appearance or physical map that then functions to guide and determine our responses to physical reality. In other words, physical reality provides us with information regarding the environment in which we are operating, but it is conceptual reality that determines how we respond to that physically perceived environment. Physical reality just tells you a flame is there, but it is conceptual reality that keeps you from sticking your hand in it a second time. And conceptual reality is always there, superimposed upon physical reality, guiding and determining your responses to physically perceived reality, whether you know it or not, and most do not. And because it is our conceptual reality that determines how we respond to physical reality, where we actually get to make a choice with regard to how we respond to physical reality is in how we choose to connect the experiential dots as we construct our conceptual realities. And beliefs are a type of conceptual reality, and as such, they guide and determine our responses to physical reality. And that's why propaganda and misinformation work to control behavior, because they help establish belief, and belief determines the response. And individuals that employ propaganda and misinformation employ it in order to get other individuals to respond to reality in a way that, in some way, benefits the propagandist. But propaganda and misinformation only work when people buy into the propaganda and misinformation by choosing to believe it. A belief is just a mental connect-the-dot structure that has been constructed by drawing lines or forming connections between various physical and mental experiential dots, according to how we, for whatever reason, see those experiential dots as being related. And those connections may be accurately reflective of the way those connected and now conceived realities are related, or they may be complete inversions of the way those connected and now conceived realities are related. And when those connections are accurately reflective, the result is a concept that produces a functional response to reality. And when those connections are not accurately reflective, the result is a concept that produces a dysfunctional response to reality. And a dysfunctional response to reality is what propagandists are aiming to achieve, since it is those dysfunctional responses that, in some way, benefit the propagandist. For example, getting people to absolutely hate and despise a group of people that are actually trying to help them, so that they continuously and wholeheartedly work against any effort made by the people that are trying to help them, because it benefits the propagandist in some way to thwart the efforts of the people who are trying to help. That is true dysfunction, and that is the world we live in, thanks to propaganda and the controlling power of beliefs. And as a result of that controlling power, when our minds superimpose upon physical reality the mistaken belief or erroneously constructed conceptual reality that indicates or tells us that physical reality is the reality that's actually there, we respond to physical reality accordingly by making no effort to project our awareness beyond what remains just a mind-generated appearance. And it is in that way that a mind-generated mental appearance overlaps and so combines with a mind-generated physical appearance to convert the physical appearance into a reality-obscuring and self-obscuring delusion that then, as a delusion, also contains within itself the mental appearance or mistaken belief that was used to convert the physical appearance into a delusion. And that is how our mistakenly believing physical reality to be the reality that's actually there causes physical reality to function as the walls of a cage in which our individual awarenesses inadvertently and effectively traps itself. But that's just the beginning of the effective entrapment of our individual awarenesses within our minds, because human beings take that same process to the next iterative level by superimposing mistaken beliefs upon what are just concepts, and so by superimposing concepts upon concepts, so that we then see those concepts as being realities that are actually there, after which we then respond accordingly by not trying to project our awareness beyond those conceptual appearances. And that is how we cause conceptual reality, which is just a different sort of mind-generated appearance, to function as the walls of a cage in which our individual awareness inadvertently and effectively traps itself. And the conceptual reality in which pretty much every human being that has ever lived ends up being trapped within is the mind-generated conceptual avatar or concept of self that we refer to as the ego. Because the moment you believe that mind-generated concept of self to be what you really are, you respond accordingly by not trying to project your awareness beyond it, leaving your individual awareness effectively trapped within it. And while effectively trapped within your ego, you respond to reality accordingly, which is to say, according to your egoic conditioning, which means according to whatever mind-generated concept of self you have assembled by connecting various experiential dots. And so we may have free will, but it doesn't really operate at the level of immediate response, but instead operates at the level of what we choose to believe, because it is those beliefs, which are conceptual realities, that determines how our awareness responds to what we become aware of as reality while flowing through and animating these relationally structured forms of ourself. And it is because free will operates at that level that I am making the case that you would be well served by changing what you believe about the nature of the experiential realities in general and physical reality in particular. Because if your beliefs about those realities don't change, then your response to those realities won't change. And if your response to the experiential realities doesn't change, then those appearances will continue to function as the walls of a cage in which your individual awareness will remain effectively trapped for as long as it continues to flow through and animate your body and mind. And to better understand how mistaken belief converts what are only mind-generated appearances into delusions that then function as the walls of a cage in which we inadvertently and unknowingly trap our individual awarenesses, we need only consider a pane of glass that contains a reflection. The pane of glass can be easily seen through, but if you get caught up in the reflection, mistakenly believing it to be the reality that's actually there, that is where your attention will remain focused, and you won't become aware of what lies on the other side of the glass, simply because you won't make any effort to direct your attention beyond the appearance that lies within it. And in the same way, our minds are transparent structures, inasmuch as they are composed of a formless reality. But our minds are able to produce appearances or unreal realities, and those unrealities can be either functionally transparent or functionally non-transparent, depending upon what an individual awareness believes regarding their nature. Specifically, if an individual awareness correctly believes the experiential appearances or unreal realities that its mind is producing are just created appearances, then those appearances are functionally transparent, because one remains aware that there is a reality beyond them that they can project their awareness toward or into. On the other hand, if an individual awareness incorrectly and so mistakenly believes the experiential appearances or unreal realities that its mind is producing to be realities that are actually there, then those appearances become functionally non-transparent, because that individual awareness is then delusionally aware that there is no reality beyond them that they can project their awareness toward or into, and so they just don't. And that then leaves that now diluted awareness effectively trapped in the environment of experiential appearances that its mind is producing, because it has unknowingly rendered itself unwilling and so effectively unable to project its awareness beyond those appearances, not because it can't, but only because there seems to be no reason to try, and so it just doesn't. Our situation is actually pretty simple once you understand what's actually going on beyond the appearances to produce the appearances. But almost no one ever looks beyond the appearances, because why would they? Because they mistakenly believe they're already aware of what's actually there and of what's actually going on. Science explains reality purely in terms of the movements and interrelations of physical reality, because scientists believe that physical reality, both classical and quantum, is the reality that's actually and objectively there. And I understand that because I used to believe that too. And then I chose to stop believing that. And that made it possible for me to project my awareness beyond the physical appearances and into the reality that's actually there, and gradually become increasingly aware of what's actually there and of what's actually going on. And as a result, I am now able to explain reality in terms of the movements and interrelations of the formless reality that is actually there, where physical reality, both classical and quantum, still continue to appear to be. But in order to understand my explanation of reality, you have to recognize that there are two kinds of realities of which we can be aware: a kind that is real and a kind that is unreal. Or, put another way, a kind that is the reality that is actually there, and a kind that, although it may appear to be a reality that is actually there, is not actually there because it's just a mind-generated appearance. And the explanation of reality I'm putting forth is completely internally consistent and is also completely consistent with established and fundamental scientific facts, because physical facts don't change when one changes their belief in the nature of those facts. Instead, all that changes is the way that one becomes able to connect those facts into a conceptual model and description of reality. The speed of light remains the speed of light, Planck's constant remains Planck's constant, E still equals mc squared, etc., etc., etc. None of that has changed. But what has changed is that previously all we had were physical facts and equations that stated known relations between those facts and absolutely nothing more. And we still have all of that. But what we now have in addition to that is something that we didn't have before, which is an understanding of why those facts exist as facts and how they are all related. But you can only have that new additional understanding if you are willing to let go of your mistaken belief in physical reality as being in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there, so that you can instead choose to believe that it's just a created appearance. And so, the price of this deeper understanding does not involve you being asked to believe that any truly established physical fact is other than it is, but only involves you being asked to change what you believe about the nature of established physical facts, so you can see past them and into the singular and yet relationally structured reality that's actually there producing those facts. And the purpose of all of this explaining and describing of reality is to provide your individual awareness with the opportunity to become aware that you have a choice and that there is another story you can believe about physical reality, and so an alternative path you can go down that does not have the downside of obscuring from your awareness your own reality and leaving you effectively trapped in a mind generated experiential cage. And if you take that alternative path, experiential reality won't go anywhere. You just won't be adding to it the additional conceptual thing, i.e., a mistaken belief in its nature that turns it into an awareness cage and so turns it into a place and space of suffering. Now, what evidence do I have that awareness exists in the way I have just described it as existing, which is as two individual poles of an indivisible awareness duality that emerges as a result of some portion of awareness flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself? One bit of evidence I have is the fact that I was able to figure all this stuff out. And the other bit of evidence I have is the existence and operation of emotional reality. Specifically, one bit of evidence that the reality that we really are functions as two poles of an indivisible awareness duality as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself lies in how I was able to figure out how the reality that is actually there causes all of this to happen, and in so doing functions as both the magician and audience in the magic show that we perceive and conceive as the physical universe. That's how completely internally consistent this model of reality is, because even the understanding of how it came to be is itself explained by the model. Because how I was able to figure all this stuff out was by becoming aware at a relatively early age of the other pole of my own individuality, and then learning to ask that individuality questions and gradually getting better at receiving the answers, as my mind gradually developed the conceptual context needed to ask the right questions and understand the answers. Because it's just like Jimmy sang in one of his songs, just ask the axis, she knows everything. And the reason the axis, or the complementary pole of any localized individuality, knows everything is because that complementary pole has a completely different and non-localized perspective and is aware of reality from that non-localized and so universal perspective. Put another way, we are aware of the self-relational process that the fundamental reality is undergoing from a perspective that lies within that process, and it is aware of the self-relational process that the fundamental reality is undergoing from a perspective that lies outside of that process, and so takes in the whole of that process. By way of analogy, our localized individual perspective is like that of a leaf in a tree, and our view of the tree as a whole is obscured by all the other leaves and branches. And so all we are left with is a very partial and fragmented view of the whole. On the other hand, the perspective of our non-localized individual pole is like that of the trunk of that same tree, and so it is able to view the whole of reality as it branches out and forms the relations with itself that produces what we are aware of from our localized perspective as the physical universe. And it can share what it is aware of as reality from that non-localized perspective if one is able and willing to listen. But it's not like taking dictation. It's more like extremely subtle waves of meaning and understanding reflecting back as my attention is focused upon trying to understand some situation or set of realities as seen from my localized perspective. And sometimes I understand right away, and other times it may take 20 years or more for me to understand what it's trying to tell me, if I haven't yet developed the capacity to understand. It is simply the case that all great art, music, and insights, i.e., those that have true and lasting value, come not from the mind, but from an individual awareness, either consciously or unconsciously, tapping into that non-localized level of awareness, because that level of awareness is the universal muse. And that non-localized pole of awareness is intrinsically aware of the process that the reality that it is undergoing as it structurally evolves. And it is also aware of the situation that we are in. And it is continuously trying to draw us, i.e., the other pole of its individuality, out of that situation and into awareness of our true self and nature. And the concept of God arises when a localized individual awareness becomes, to some degree, accurately aware of its non-localized and so universal pole of awareness as a reality that is more aware and so truly different than itself, but then makes the mistake of believing that non-localized pole of awareness to be a reality that is truly separate from and so other than itself. It is true that the non-localized pole of awareness is really big, and we, as the localized pole of that indivisible duality, are really, really tiny by comparison. And its relative bigness and our relative smallness and our different perspectives do make it truly different from us. But those relative differences do not make it other than, and so cannot make it better than, because it's the exact same reality we are, since the reality that both we and it are is the formless real reality that we refer to as awareness. Same indivisible reality, two different perspectives, one of which is our localized perspective from inside the process of self-relation looking out, and the other of which is its non-localized perspective from outside the process of self-relation looking in. It's just functioning as one pole of an indivisible awareness duality, and we are functioning as the other pole of that same indivisible duality. And it is aware of reality from its non-localized perspective, and we are aware of reality from our localized perspective. And it knows that, and it wants you to know that, because not knowing that creates an imaginary and so unreal wall between you and it, and so creates a division between you and it that does not actually exist, but which operates for you as if that wall does actually exist, because you mistakenly believe that imaginary division between you and it to be a real reality, thereby keeping it either somewhat or completely obscured from your awareness, which then causes you to suffer either somewhat or completely. And it doesn't want you to suffer and is doing everything it can to draw you out of that suffering. But it can't force or drag your individual awareness out of a delusional reality that you first create as a function of what you have chosen to believe and then perpetuate by acting upon the delusional reality as if it were the actual. Put another way, non-localized awareness can't force your localized awareness to become aware of any reality that your localized awareness is actively preventing itself from becoming aware of as a result of how it is dealing with what it is already aware of as reality. More specifically, when the reality you are aware of is a delusional reality, you then naturally respond to reality according to how it delusionally appears. And acting according to how reality delusionally appears has the effect of forcing your awareness to continue to operate from within that delusional reality, because such an action is always a secondary movement of awareness that must have as its basis the primary movement of awareness that first creates the delusional reality by superimposing a mistaken belief upon some created appearance. As I said before, as the fundamental reality, you have the freedom to choose to believe whatever you want to believe. But the price of that freedom is that you cannot escape the cause and effect consequences of what you choose to believe. And the cause and effect consequence of mistakenly believing an unreal reality to be a real reality is the obscuring of the real reality from your awareness and the effective entrapment of your individual pole of awareness in a delusional unreal reality, where you then suffer. But you suffer not as some sort of punishment for making what is, at least initially, an unavoidable mistake. Instead, you suffer because while operating from within a delusional reality, you act according to how reality delusionally appears. And more often than not, those delusion-based actions cause you to unknowingly and inadvertently direct your localized awareness in opposition to your non-localized self. And that inadvertent self-opposition creates the negative emotional realities that are the essence of what we experience as psychological suffering. And that brings us to the second bit of evidence that indicates that the reality that we really are functions as two poles of an indivisible awareness duality as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself. And that second bit of evidence is the existence and operation of the experiential reality that we refer to as emotional reality. And that's because you can only truly understand what emotional reality is and how it is created by recognizing the existence of a relation of awareness to itself that can only exist while awareness is operating as two poles of an indivisible awareness duality. The purpose of every type of experiential reality is to provide our localized awarenesses with information that we can use as we flow through and animate these relationally structured forms of ourself. And emotional information exists because the relation of individuality that awareness forms with itself as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself causes an additional relation of awareness to itself to come into existence once it is functioning as an indivisible awareness duality. And that additional relation is the relation that exists between the direction of motion of our localized individuality and the direction of motion of our non-localized individuality. And that additional relation of motion produces what we are aware of as our in-the-moment emotional reality. And that relation of motion has only two possible orientations, self-aligned or self-oppositional, and so has only two potential experiential outcomes. Specifically, relations of self-alignment produce what we are aware of as positive, good-feeling, wanted, and so attractive emotional experiences, whereas relations of self-opposition produce what we are aware of as negative, bad-feeling, unwanted, and so repulsive emotional experiences. And the relation of self-alignment feels positive, good, wanted, and attractive, while the relation of self-opposition feels negative, bad, unwanted, and repulsive, simply because self-alignment is like swimming with the current, whereas self-opposition is like swimming against the current. And the current we are swimming with or against is the direction of flow of the non-localized pole of our own individuality. And so, if you are aware of and so experiencing a truly positive emotion, it's because at that moment your localized pole of awareness is flowing in alignment with the direction in which your non-localized pole of awareness is flowing or moving. Conversely, if you are aware of and so experiencing a truly negative emotion, it's because at that moment your localized pole of awareness is flowing in opposition to the direction in which your non-localized pole of awareness is flowing or moving. That is the information that emotional reality is meant to provide us with. Immediate in-the-moment feedback regarding whether the direction of flow of our localized awareness is aligned with or opposed to the direction of flow of our non-localized awareness. And we need that information because the fourth level relational structures that our localized awarenesses are flowing through and animating function optimally when the direction of flow of our localized pole of awareness aligns with the direction of flow of our non-localized pole of awareness. And I'm not going to go into why that is, other than to say when you place a water wheel in a river so it can perform some mechanical function, when it is turned by the flow of the river has a direction of flow, and such mechanisms are designed to work according to that direction of flow. And in the same way, these fourth level relational awareness structures are being mechanically moved by the flow of awareness through them, and the river of awareness has a direction of flow. And so these structures were designed to function optimally according to that direction of flow. But here's the thing. Once some portion of that river of awareness is flowing through and animating a fourth level relational structure, and so is functioning as a localized individuality, as an individual, that localized portion of the river of awareness has the ability to flow itself in a direction that is other than the direction that the river as a whole is flowing. What that means is that we, as individuals, have the ability to flow our localized individuality in alignment with or opposition to our non-localized individuality. And because we have that ability, we are able to create and experience positive and negative emotional realities. And because positive emotions are only ever created through a relation of aligned motion, and negative emotions are only ever created through a relation of oppositional motion, our in-the-moment emotional reality provides us with immediate in-the-moment informational feedback that lets us know what we are choosing in that moment as our internal and individual direction of motion relative to the consistent direction of motion that is being continuously chosen by the non-localized pole of our indivisible awareness duality. And here the use of the term direction refers to a direction of conscious intention. Self-relational movement is by default self-aligned movement, as we see in the yin-yang diagram, and our default relation to our non-localized individuality is like that of the yin moving in relation to the yang and vice versa, except we are a very tiny individual pole and it is a very large individual pole. But the essential relation is the same regardless of relative size. What that means is that, absent other factors, it is in our nature to flow in alignment with our larger or non-localized self. Put another way, absent other factors, it is in our nature to direct our localized awarenesses according to a conscious intention that is in alignment with the conscious intention of our non-localized self, because we are the same reality after all, and so it is natural for us to operate with the same intention, which is why self-relational movement is by default self-aligned movement. However, self-relational movement becomes self-oppositional movement when a localized awareness begins to operate with a conscious intention that does not align with the conscious intention of its non-localized self. And a localized awareness only begins to operate with a conscious intention that does not align with the conscious intention of its non-localized self once it is operating from within a delusional reality, where it is then aware of reality in a way that is completely different than the way its non-localized self is aware of reality, because it is then mistakenly aware of reality as being composed of separate things that are other than itself, rather than accurately aware of reality as being composed of one truly indivisible non-thing or no-thing that is identical to itself. The natural and so default intention of self-relational individualities as they move in relation to their complementary individuality is that of complete acceptance and non-resistance with regard to the other individuality's beingness. But such complete acceptance and non-resistance with respect to another individuality can only exist when an individuality is aware that the other individuality is an indivisible aspect of itself. And that sort of intentionality of conscious movement is felt as unconditional love. Put another way, unconditional love is the emotional reality that is created when there is a self-relational movement with respect to another individuality that has the intention of completely accepting and not resisting that other individuality. But that sort of intention of conscious movement toward another individuality can only exist when there is a recognition of oneness or identity with respect to the other individuality. And the non-localized pole of our individuality is aware that our localized individuality is an indivisible aspect of itself, and so it is always moving with an intention of complete acceptance and non-resistance with respect to us, meaning it loves us unconditionally. But we, as the localized pole of that indivisible awareness duality, do not move with an intention of complete acceptance and non-resistance with respect to our non-localized pole, but instead tend to move with the intention of some degree of opposition toward and resistance to that non-localized pole, because we are operating from within delusional realities where we have lost sight of our identity and oneness with all that is, and instead see most of reality as not self or other. And that self-oppositional movement produces psychological suffering, because that self-oppositional and so non-aligned relation of motion creates what we then become aware of as a negative emotional reality of one sort or another, i.e. fear, anger, hatred, jealousy, greed, etc. You see, what I'm doing is explaining why you experience what you experience as reality based not upon what you delusionally believe reality to be, because what you delusionally believe reality to be is just a bunch of mind-generated physical and mental appearances that are being superimposed by projection and reflection upon the self-relational awareness that is both actually there and what you really are. Instead, what I'm doing is explaining why you experience what you experience as reality based upon what the self-relational awareness that is actually there is doing to create experiential reality as an appearance. And in all cases, what the self-relational awareness that is actually there is doing to create an experiential reality is becoming involved in some sort of relation with itself, because it has nothing else other than itself to work with, because it's all that actually is, because everything else is just an appearance that it is creating through self-relation and then becoming either accurately or inaccurately aware of from an individual perspective. And so here's the thing. Although we, as individual awarenesses, are free to operate according to what we delusionally believe reality to be, what we experience as our emotional reality is created as a function of how reality actually is, and not according to how we mistakenly believe it to be. As an analogy, if a very realistic image of a pillow is painted or projected on a brick wall, and you then punch what you mistakenly believe to be that pillow, what you feel as a result happens according to what's actually there and not according to what you mistakenly believe to be there. And in the exact same way, when we project our individual awarenesses with a conscious intention of opposition and resistance toward the physical realities that we mistakenly believe are actually there. What we become emotionally aware of is a function of the relation that that intention causes us to form with what's actually there. Because we can't actually form a relation with a reality that only appears to be there, no matter how much we firmly and yet mistakenly believe that appearance to be the reality that's actually there. Put another way, the only reality that the reality that is actually there can actually form a relation with is the reality that's actually there. And certain relations of that real reality to itself create certain appearances or unreal realities that that real reality then becomes aware of as an experiential reality of one sort or another, i.e. physical, mental, or emotional. And because what's actually there where physical reality appears to be is the non-localized pole of our indivisible awareness duality, albeit in a relationally structured form, a conscious intention of opposition and resistance toward any physical reality places us in a relation of self-opposition so that we end up creating and becoming aware of a negative emotional reality. Now, here it is important to understand that a conscious intention of opposition and resistance does not refer to external action, but refers to an internal movement of awareness. External opposition and resistance is sometimes necessary, but external opposition and resistance does not have to come from a place of internal opposition and resistance. And probably the best example of that is Gandhi's passive resistance to the British occupation of India. Internal opposition and resistance comes from a place of delusion, where the indivisible reality that is actually there has been obscured, leaving that which is being externally opposed and resisted known as not self or other, in which case it is then also internally resisted and opposed as well. On the other hand, internal acceptance and allowing comes from a place of clarity and understanding, where the indivisible reality that is actually there is no longer fully obscured, so that that which is being externally opposed and resisted is, to some degree, known as self or not other, in which case it then becomes possible to internally accept and allow that which one is externally resisting and opposing. But because what most individuals presently know as reality is mostly delusion, any need to externally oppose is almost invariably accompanied by internal opposition and resistance, which is to say, a conscious intention of opposition and resistance. And that delusional tendency creates a lot of negative emotion and is taken full advantage of by propagandists and demagogues who do their best to convince people that they are right to hate, despise, and fear anyone who does not look like them or believes things that they do not believe, even though that's pretty much the exact opposite of what Jesus taught, i.e., love thy neighbor as thyself. And he taught that because ultimately, beyond all the delusional and so reality obscuring physical and mental appearances, thy neighbor is thyself. And thy neighbor is thyself because the same indivisible awareness of which the entire relationally structured universe is constructed and composed is the same reality that is flowing through and animating any fourth level relational structure. Again, what we perceive and conceive as life or the life force is just the tip of a relationally structured iceberg that is entirely composed of that life force. What that means is that seemingly empty space, light, and matter are just as alive as you are, inasmuch as what is actually there where those inanimate physical realities appear to be is the exact same reality that is flowing through and animating your body, and in so doing, imparting it with the quality that we call life. Put another way, the quality that we perceive and conceive as life is just the fourth way that that which is life itself has become stably structured through iterative and so progressive relation to itself. And so that which is life itself does not actually come and go, but always is. It just seems to come and go at the fourth level of relational structure as a result of temporarily flowing through and animating what are ultimately just relationally structured forms of its uncreated and deathless self. And as a result, at the physical surface level, we see the play of life and death, life and death, life and death, as the animating force enters and then leaves fourth level relational structures. But that play of life and death is just our very limited and surface level perception of the waves that exist at the surface of an ocean of relationally structured reality that is entirely composed of that animating force. But we don't see it that way because all we know as reality are our mind-generated physical etchings of that ocean and our mind-generated mental conceptual interpretations of those physical etchings. And that is all we know as reality because through mistaken belief in the nature of those appearances, we continuously convert those mind-generated appearances into delusions that continuously obscure from our individual awarenesses the formless, timeless, uncreated, and deathless reality that is both actually there and what we really are, thereby causing mind-generated appearances that are no more real than reflections of rainbows to function as the walls of a cage in which our individual awarenesses become effectively trapped. And once you create and enter into a delusional reality, the way you then naturally and internally respond to reality is not according to how reality actually is, but according to how it delusionally appears. And internally responding to reality according to how it delusionally appears can create either a positive or a negative emotion, depending upon the conscious intention of that response as allowing or resisting, which then places your individual awareness in a relation of alignment with or opposition to its non-localized self. Long story short, while ensconced in our delusional realities, we respond to reality reactively, which means reflexively, internally allowing and accepting that which appears wanted and internally opposing and resisting that which appears unwanted, so that we tend to feel good when wanted things arise and tend to feel bad when unwanted things arise. And that leads us to the mistaken conclusion that how we feel emotionally is a cause and effect function of external reality. And that mistaken conclusion, which is just another delusion, hides from us the fact that our emotional reality is actually a cause and effect function of our internal attitude of allowing a resistance with respect to whatever we are aware of as reality in that moment. And so hides from us the fact that it is possible to control what we become aware of as our emotional reality if we can learn to take conscious control of our internal attitude toward what we are aware of as reality, rather than having our internal attitude determined by unconscious reactivity, i.e., reflective acceptance of the wanted and reflective opposition to the unwanted. As I said in the previous video, the cause and effect relation between internal attitude and created emotional reality is not a difficult thing to verify in your own experience, but you have to start with relatively insignificant unwanted events, such as traffic lights and waiting in line. Become aware of the negative emotion that the unwanted event seems to be generating, and then consciously choose to stop internally opposing the way reality is at that moment. And then notice if and how your emotional reality changes. That's all. But regardless of how you internally respond to reality, and regardless of the emotion created, internally responding to reality as it delusionally appears always has the same ultimate result. And that same ultimate result is the effective entrapment of your individual awareness within a delusional reality. And internally responding to reality as it delusionally appears always has the effect of keeping your individual awareness confined to the delusional reality it is responding to or acting upon, because delusions don't exist as delusions by themselves, but only exist as delusions as a result of your active input in creating them. Here's how the awareness trap works. In order to respond to reality as it delusionally appears, we first have to create the delusional reality through the movement of our individual awareness by which we attach a mistaken belief to some appearance. Therefore, responding to reality as it delusionally appears, which can only happen once we have already created and entered into the delusion, obligates our individual awareness to continue to engage in the movement by which we created and entered into the delusional reality. It's just that simple. But you can only understand the simplicity of the awareness trap once you recognize and accept that what you are aware of as the nature of any experiential reality is not something that is already objectively there that you are passively taking in, but is in all cases something that you are playing an active role in creating as a function of what you choose to believe about the nature of that experiential reality. And in order to clarify how simple the awareness trap is, I am now going to explain how the awareness trap functions to bind us within our delusional realities in the exact same way that a string is bound into a simple knot. A simple knot is formed in a string as a function of two sequential movements and relations of the string to itself, with the second movement and relation locking in the first movement and relation. And in an analogous way, our individual awarenesses become effectively trapped within delusional realities as a function of two sequential movements
of our awareness, with the second movement locking in the first movement. And with respect to the awareness trap, the first movement is the one where we attach a false belief to some experiential appearance, thereby converting it into a delusion. And that first movement is analogous to laying a string upon itself. And then, based on the delusional appearance created by the first movement, a second movement of our individual awareness takes place that is our internal response to the delusional appearance. And that second movement is analogous to the string forming a second relation with itself based on the first relation. And that second relation locks the string into the first relation, thereby creating an extremely stable structure that exists as a function of two sequential movements and relation of the string to itself. And so, the two sequential movements that our individual awareness undertakes and becomes involved in are the primary movement that creates the delusional reality, followed by the secondary movement that is our internal response to the delusional reality. And that secondary movement locks us into the first movement, thereby creating an extremely stable awareness trap in which our individual awarenesses effectively cage themselves as we lock ourselves into the movement by which we are creating and entering into the delusional reality as a result of naturally responding to reality as it delusionally appears once we have created it. And so first we create some delusion, and then we naturally act on the basis of that created delusion, which then effectively forces us to keep creating the delusion, which we then naturally respond to, which then forces us to keep creating it and responding to it, and on and on and on it goes, leaving our individual awarenesses in the situation in which we now find ourselves, surrounded by and effectively trapped within mind-generated physical and mental appearances that we are continuously and unknowingly converting into reality obscuring delusions, leaving us with no awareness whatsoever of the beginningless and endless life that's both within us and all around us, and is also what we really are. And that effective entrapment is the bondage referred to by true spiritual traditions and religions, i.e., individual awarenesses effectively trapped within what are ultimately nothing more than mind-generated appearances that those entrapped awarenesses are themselves converting into self-obscuring delusions, and so into the walls of a cage through mistaken belief in the nature of those appearances. And that effective entrapment is also the situation described in Plato's allegory of the cave, which is really Socrates' allegory of the cave, since he's the one who came up with it. Just Google it and you'll see. All I'll say is this: in that allegory, the cave in which people are held captive, knowing what are only shadows on the wall is what is real, and all that is real is the human mind. In any case, because our bondage and entrapment is completely self-imposed, it is a bondage and entrapment that can only be self-undone. That is the main thing to understand. No one but you can get you out of the delusional situation that your individual awareness has naturally fallen into as a result of flowing through and animating a human body and mind, because it is not a situation that is being imposed upon you by some outside force. Instead, it is a situation that you are yourself creating by the force and action of your own individual awareness, by first creating a delusion and then acting upon it. Other individuals can point the way out, and your non-localized individuality is continuously trying to guide you out, but the movement out of it has to be your own. But the mistake that most individuals make once they decide they have had enough of the situation and the suffering it invariably produces, and so start trying to get out of it, is they mistakenly think they have to do something extra or additional to escape the situation. But here's the problem with that approach. All of those extra and additional actions to escape the situation just perpetuate the situation, because they are all actions that ultimately still have the delusion as their basis. For example, I decide that I'm going to meditate or perform some other action so I can become liberated and enlightened. But because my individual awareness is still operating from within the experiential delusion while trying to get out of that delusion, the I that I'm trying to liberate is itself just a mind-created concept of self. And so by trying to liberate and enlighten my delusional sense of self, I'm actually responding to a delusion, which then keeps my individual awareness effectively trapped in that delusional sense of self, even if I do end up feeling emotionally better as a result of the meditation or other action. You see, to escape the delusional situation that we are in, it's not about what we do, but is really about what we stop doing. Because it's all the delusion-based doing that perpetuates the situation by locking our individual awarenesses into the movement whereby we create and enter into our delusional realities. And if you can understand the simple knot-like mechanism by which an individual awareness is able to effectively trap itself in a delusional reality, then you can understand that there are only two things you can stop doing to stop perpetuating the delusional situation in which your individual awareness is, in all likelihood, effectively trapping itself. And there are only two things you can stop doing because the awareness trap is the result of just two sequential movements of awareness, and so is the result of two sequential doings: delusion creation and delusional response to that delusional creation. And so one of the things you can stop doing is you can stop reactively and reflexively internally responding to reality as it delusionally appears, which then makes it possible to internally respond to reality in a way other than through reflexive allowing of the wanted and reflexive opposition to the unwanted. Now here you might ask, but if I'm stuck in a delusional reality, so that delusion is all I know, how the fuck am I supposed to respond to reality in a way that is not delusion-based? And that's a good question, because that's the essential conundrum. And that's where the conscious creation of your emotional reality comes in. Because the other non-reactive, non-reflexive way of internally responding to reality is according to the emotional reality that you want to create and experience as a result of that internal response. Because even if you are still fully ensconced in a delusional reality, by internally responding to reality not according to how it appears, but according to the emotional reality you want to create through that response, you are not responding on the basis of a delusion, and so are not undertaking a secondary movement that locks you into the primary movement by which you are creating and entering into that delusional reality. You may still be performing that primary movement, and so may still be creating and entering into a delusional reality, but by internally responding according to the emotional reality you consciously want to create, you are no longer binding yourself to that primary movement, and so are no longer obligating yourself to keep creating and entering into a delusional reality. And not doing that will give you access to the second thing you can stop doing, which is to stop applying a false belief to what are just mind-generated appearances, so that you are no longer converting those appearances into reality-obscuring and self-obscuring delusions. Put another way, you can't change what you mistakenly believe about the nature of the experiential appearances while internally responding on the basis of how those appearances delusionally appear as a function of that mistaken belief. Because the delusional response is a secondary movement that locks you into the primary movement, whereby you create the delusion using that mistaken belief. But if you can cease to lock or knot yourself into that primary movement by not responding reactively and reflexively according to the wanted or unwanted nature of the delusion, but according to the emotion you want to create regardless of the delusion, then you are finally free to stop using that mistaken belief to create the delusion, should you choose to do so. And if you can stop doing that, it then becomes much easier to become aware of the formless reality that is actually there beyond and behind all the experiential appearances. Because the ultimate goal is to become directly aware of that reality and accurately recognize it as self, as opposed to remaining aware of only the experiential appearances. Because remaining aware of only the experiential appearances leaves you with no choice but to mistakenly recognize some relatively random set of those appearances as self, which is what we have all done. I am this, I am that. I'm smart, I'm dumb. I'm tall, I'm short. I'm good, I'm bad. I'm pretty, I'm ugly. I'm successful, I'm a failure. And on and on and on and on it goes. And it's all complete and utter bullshit. Because what you really are is none of those mind-generated experiential appearances. Direct awareness of the formless reality that you really are is true liberation, because while directly aware of that formless reality, your individual awareness is free of the main appearance in which it unknowingly keeps itself caged. And that main appearance is your mind-generated concept of self or ego. All the ego is whatever set of mind-generated experiential this and that's you have mistakenly attached and applied to your innate sense of being or I amness, thereby converting that innate sense of being into a delusion that then keeps hidden from your individual awareness your true reality and self. You are, but you are not this or that. You just are. And the formless reality that you are is functioning as an indivisible awareness duality, and so as a set of individualities, as a result of flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself. And the formless reality that you really are is ultimately both of those individualities, i.e., the localized individuality that is flowing through and animating a fourth level structure, and the non localized individuality that is everything else and everywhere else. But as things stand right now, you have inadvertently and effectively trapped yourself in the localized pole of that indivisible duality as a result of misidentifying with the experiential appearances that your mind is able to create as a result of your individual and animating flow. And because that misidentification, which is a false belief, converts those appearances into reality obscuring and self-obscuring delusions, that then becomes the basis of how you internally respond to reality. And those delusion-based responses then lock or knot you into that misidentification, and so leave your localized individuality effectively trapped in a delusion of self, where you then suffer, as you then unknowingly and quite often end up internally directing the flow of your localized awareness in opposition to the directional flow of your non-localized awareness, since you are then no longer acting to satisfy the true desires of your true self, but are instead acting to satisfy the delusional desires of what is only a delusion of self. In modern terms, once you misidentify with the ego or mind-generated concept of self, the ego makes you its bitch. Because then the real you, meaning the beginningless, timeless, uncreated, and deathless reality out of which the entire universe is constructed and of which it is actually composed, spends its entire individual organic life attempting to serve the seeming needs of what is just an appearance that it is itself creating using an individual mind. It's absolutely amazing what we are able to do and what we have done to our individual selves as a result of doing nothing more than overlapping two mind-generated conceptual appearances, one of which is a mind-generated concept of self, and the other of which is a mistaken belief regarding the nature of that mind-generated appearance, thereby converting what is only a mind-generated concept of self or ego into a delusion that then functions as a cage in which our individual awarenesses effectively trap themselves, as we then act primarily to serve that delusional sense of self, and in so doing, lock ourselves into the movement whereby we, through mistaken belief, create and enter into that delusional sense of self. And so, contrary to what you may have heard, liberation does not come through destruction of the ego. Trying to destroy or do away with the ego is just a delusion-based action that will just leave your individual awareness effectively trapped in a different ego. You need an ego, a mind-generated concept of self, or conceptual avatar, whatever you want to call it, to function in this world. But you don't need to mistakenly know that conceptual avatar is what you really are to function in this world. In fact, it is mistakenly knowing the ego as what we really are that is the source of all human dysfunction, as we then act primarily in the service of that extremely limited, fragmented, and now delusional mind-generated sense of self, and in so doing, more often than not, end up inadvertently moving in internal opposition to our non-localized individuality or self, which then causes us to suffer, since we have no choice but to become aware of whatever negative emotional reality that self-oppositional relation produces. And so the goal is not to destroy or do away with the ego. The goal is simply to see the ego for what it really is. And what it really is just a mind-generated conceptual appearance. But in order to be able to see that, we first have to stop doing the two related things that we are doing that make it impossible to see that. And those two related things are continuous reactivity towards delusional appearances and continuously imposing mistaken beliefs upon what are only experiential appearances, so that they then exist as delusional appearances that then function to obscure from our individual awarenesses the reality that is both actually there and what we really are. At no point in your organic life have you ever been anything other than the reality that you really are. And when your organic life comes to an end, because the fourth level relational structure that you are presently flowing through and animating is no longer able to sustain that animating flow, you will still be the reality that you really are now. The question is, will you live your entire organic life in complete unawareness of the reality that you really are, caught up in the experiential dream, mistakenly knowing it as what is real and all that is real, and suffering as a result? Or will you begin to wake up from that dream before your organic life is over by becoming directly aware of the reality that's both actually there and what you really are? In which case, then, unlike a regular dream, the experiential dream will still be there, only it will then be known as the unreal appearance that it is, as opposed to the real reality it never was, but was only mistakenly believed to be. Put another way, are you going to spend your life stuck in the audience section of this magic act that we call the universe? Or are you going to realize that the localized individual awareness that you are presently functioning as here in the audience section is inseparable from the non-localized individual awareness that is out there functioning as the magician to make it all happen? Again, it's your call. I'm just here to let you know what your options are, and that there is another way other than spending your life banging your head against the walls of delusion as you naturally try to escape the suffering that being trapped in a delusion invariably produces. The Buddha said, "I teach suffering and the end of suffering." And while I sure as fuck am no Buddha, that's what all my yammering ultimately boils down to, explaining how we got into this delusional situation and how being in it causes us to naturally act in a way that simultaneously produces suffering and perpetuates the experiential delusion, so that we can just as naturally and without any additional effort stop acting that way, and in so not doing, exit that delusion and the suffering it invariably produces. If you look at what is actually your arm and you see a snake, most likely you're either going to jab at it or run away screaming. And either way, you get suffering. And that is the relation of most human beings to the universe. They look around and see a world full of snakes where there's actually only self. And so they internally jab at or run away from that world. And either way, they cause themselves to suffer and to keep seeing snakes where there's only self. And some of those seeming snakes are truly dangerous, at least in terms of organic reality, but not because they are inherently evil, but only because their individual awarenesses are so absolutely and utterly lost and trapped within their minds and egos that they just end up doing whatever they can to try to get the suffering to go away for just a few moments, even if that means intentionally causing a few others, or even millions of others, to suffer. And so I'm just explaining as fully as I can how the reality that we really are got itself into this situation, because it seems to me that the most reliable way to break the vicious cycle of experiential delusion, self-ignorance, and suffering that we have inadvertently trapped ourselves in is to become as aware as possible of how the entire trick is done, so that we will, without any additional effort, just naturally stop doing what it is we are right now unknowingly doing to keep that vicious cycle in operation. Because once you recognize your arm as your arm and stop seeing it as a snake, the urge to jab at it or run from it simply goes away without any further effort. And then you can approach it in a different way and so get a different result, other than self-inflicted suffering. And that's it for this video. And this brings to a close my description of the part of the Universal Magic Act whereby the reality that is both actually there and what we really are sets up the stage so that it can create the experiential appearances or illusions that it uses to hide itself from itself. And in the next video, I will begin the description of how the fundamental reality uses that stage once it has been set up to produce the experiential appearances. Specifically, in the next video, I will describe why the ongoing structural evolution of the fourth level of relational structure eventually required the emergence of the specialized fourth level structure that we refer to as the mind. And I will also explain in that video how our individual awarenesses use our individual minds to produce physical reality as an externally projected appearance and mental reality as an internally reflected appearance. And then, in the sixth video, I will provide relatively definitive proof that physical reality is just a created appearance and is in no way, shape, or form the reality that is actually there, by using the simple mechanism of physical experiential creation that will be described in video 5 to explain exactly why physical reality appears in the opposite deterministic and probabilistic ways that it does at the macro and quantum levels, so that you will finally be able to hear what quantum level physical reality has been trying to tell us about the nature of physical reality for over 100 years, which is not that physical reality is fundamentally probabilistic, but is instead that physical reality is just an appearance that is being created and superimposed by our minds upon the reality that is actually there. Because ultimately, what quantum level physical reality has been trying to tell us for the past 100 years is that if we want to understand the nature of reality at its most fundamental level, we can't do so in terms of what are just created surface appearances, but instead have to do so in terms of how the reality that's actually there gives rise to those created appearances. And that's what we've been doing here, and that's what we'll keep doing until the whole amazing trick whereby we manage to hide our own reality from ourselves has been explained. And so until next time, namaste.
I think that I shall never see a poem